Welcome to the lecture for Basics of Biblical Hebrew, Chapter 6, Hebrew Prepositions. Now in this lecture we will cover the form and spelling of the three types of Hebrew prepositions, yes, three types of Hebrew prepositions, and then we'll cover quickly the definite direct object marker in Hebrew, and we'll learn what that is in a few moments. Now let's begin by first talking about some of the basic rules that govern the grammar of prepositions, both in English and in Hebrew. Look at your screens with me. First, prepositions introduce prepositional phrases which consist of a preposition, the object of a preposition, and any modifiers of that object. So in the example, upon the altar, upon is the preposition and the altar is the object of the preposition. That entire series of words, upon the altar, constitutes a prepositional phrase. Second, prepositions are used to describe relationships between words. And these relationships can be spatial or temporal or any other type of relationship. You can say, for example, the book on the desk, and that prepositional phrase on the desk is spatial. It's telling you where the book is. Or you can say, I ran into my wife after work, and after work is a prepositional phrase that is temporal. It's telling you when you ran in, or when I ran into my wife. So spatial or temporal. They're relational words. Thirdly, prepositional phrases can modify nouns or verbs. When a prepositional phrase modifies a noun, it's adjectival. When it modifies a verb, it's adverbial. It's important to know what a prepositional phrase is modifying, and usually context makes that very clear, but there are cases in which it's not always clear. Now, with regard to Hebrew, there are three different types or categories of prepositions, and these categories are based on the particular form in which the preposition appears. There are independent prepositions, makef prepositions, and inseparable prepositions. And the names are descriptive of how they appear with their objects. With independent prepositions, as in our first example here, the preposition appears before its object as its own separate word. So we have here achar hamabul, after the flood. The preposition occurs at the beginning of the prepositional phrase and its object follows, but the preposition is its own independent word. Our second example, min haaretz, from the land, appears as a preposition and its own independent word, but it's joined by this small horizontal stroke known as the makef. When this happens, the makef indicates that the whole unit, the min haaretz, is pronounced as a single accented unit. That is, the preposition has given up its accent to the object of the preposition. And finally, there is the inseparable preposition like kamelech, and this, like the definite article or the conjunction wow, is prefixed to its object. So again, independent, makef, and inseparable. Independent prepositions appear as their own word at the beginning of the prepositional phrase, and they're not joined in any particular way to their object. Makef prepositions are always joined by makef and surrender their accent to the object. And finally, inseparable prepositions are prefixed to the word that is their object, just like the conjunction wow or the definite article. So let's take a look at some of these, the five most common in the first two categories and the three most common in the third. It's just important to get to know some of these. So the five most common independent prepositions in Hebrew are lifnei, im, acharei, bain, and lama'an. So you can see with these five most common independent prepositions, they occur anywhere from over 1,000 to just under 300 times, and the distribution is going to become relevant in a minute. The five most common makef prepositions are al, el, av, eth, and min. And as you can see, all of these prepositions appear with the makef that joins them to their object. And these prepositions occur anywhere between just under 6,000 to just under 800 times. And so you can see as we move from independent prepositions to makef prepositions, the makef prepositions are much more frequent or common than the independent prepositions. Now, there are only three inseparable prepositions, and they are the prepositions lamed or la, bait or ba, and kaf or ka. And you can see here that these are going to be prefixed to their object, and look at the frequency with which they occur, 20,000, 15,000, 3,000, meaning that the prepositions in the right-hand column, the inseparable prepositions, are by far the most common prepositions in the Hebrew Bible. And so you're going to begin to see them in many, many places in almost every verse of the Hebrew Bible. Now, what you'll observe is that with independent prepositions and makef prepositions, their spelling is set. That's what they're going to look like in most instances. However, the inseparable prepositions are going to have a variation in their spelling because of the words to which they're prefixed, much like the conjunction wow. So let's look at the spelling of inseparable prepositions. And in the first instance, we want to simply observe that before most consonants, the inseparable prepositions are spelled with vocal schwa, just like the conjunction wow. And so you'll see here in each instance, the preposition is spelled with vocal schwa, as in ba-sadeh, ka-melech, and la-na'ar. In each case, the basic spelling is the consonant of the preposition, beit, kaf, or lamed, and the vocal schwa. Fairly straightforward. However, when these prepositions are prefixed to guttural consonants spelled with a hatef vowel, the preposition will take the corresponding short vowel of the hatef vowel. Yes, you've seen this before, rule of schwa 2, so here's how it goes. Before a hatef vowel, the inseparable prepositions are spelled with the corresponding short vowel of the hatef vowel. That is, again, rule of schwa 2. So in each instance below, you're going to see that they are spelled in one of three ways with one of three short vowels. The segol, the pathic, or the comets, because of the hatef vowel that follows them. They're spelled with the corresponding short vowel, the comets hatuf. So first, they're spelled with the vocal schwa before most consonants, but if you get a word that begins with one of the hatef vowels, you're going to get rule of schwa 2. This is our second application of the rule of schwa, and so you can see that learning it at the beginning is going to pay off more and more as we go. Next, we're going to see the preposition spelled not with schwa, but with hirik. Now, the reason for this is rule of schwa 1. Here's how it goes. Before most consonants with vocal schwa, the inseparable prepositions are spelled with hirik. And as you know, this is an application of rule of schwa 1. So let's look together here and see how it would have been and how it is. Let's look at our first example together. Biz roa, with an arm. Now the normal spelling of the preposition beit is with a vocal schwa under it. So let me just add the vocal schwa to this preposition here and here. Now because of the application of the rule of schwa, or rule of schwa 1, you cannot have two vocal schwas at the beginning of a word, and so it changes to a hirik in a closed syllable. And that's what we have in each instance. Biz roa, kish ol, live wreath. The vocal schwa has changed to hirik in a closed syllable because of rule of schwa 1. Again, that's why we learn these rules, because we're going to see them applied over and over again throughout the grammar, and you want to make the most of the application of the rule so that you begin to see the patterns, and these changes will not catch you off guard. So we've seen that the standard or baseline spelling for the inseparable prepositions is the vocal schwa, but we've also seen it appear with short vowels because of rule of schwa 2, or as with a hirik because of rule of schwa 1. And now we're going to talk about a very special spelling of the preposition when prefixed to nouns that also have the definite article prefix to them. So this is in some sense going to be a three-part word. You're going to have a preposition, we're going to have the definite article, and the noun. And we want to know, how does the preposition and the noun relate when they're spelled together? Let's look. In nouns with the definite article, the preposition displaces the hey of the article, but the vowel of the article is retained. Now, I've chosen to let this slide appear in three different colors so that you can see what's happening. You'll see that the definite article is blue and the prepositions are red, and then the object is in black. So let's look at what happens. Here's our first example. We have the noun midbar, or wilderness, and to it is prefixed in blue the definite article, which consists of hey, pathic, and dagesh forte. When an inseparable preposition is prefixed to the definite article, the hey of the article drops out, and the consonant of the inseparable preposition slides into the place of that article. So ha midbar becomes ba midbar. The hey is gone, so you can see that the preposition appears in red, the beit. The vocalization or the vowel pattern of the definite article remains in blue, pathic and dagesh forte. And then you have the black, in black, the object of the article ba midbar. So you've lost the hey, and so it can be tricky to do that. Let's go to the whiteboard and let me show you how that happens. We'll use the second example that appears on the previous screen, the noun melech. Mem, lamed, final cough, spelled with segols, accented on the first syllable, and then we have that final schwa in the cough. Now we're going to add in blue our definite article. The definite article consists of 3 items: the he of the definite article, the pathic of the definite article, and the dagesh forte of the definite article. Now what we want to do next is add the inseparable preposition bait. We're going to add the consonant bait, the dagesh lene associated with an initial begad kafat consonant, and then the vocal schwa. That's the normal spelling. Now, the consonant he is weak, and the technical term for what's about to happen is the intervocalic syncopation of he. You do not ever have to repeat that term or memorize that term. I'm just telling you the kind of the legit academic term behind it. Intervocalic syncopation of he, which just means this, that in certain environments, he is so weak it just drops out. And when it drops out, the other consonants slide together. So what we want to do is we want to observe that the he in this environment is lost. And because of that, we're going to observe that the consonant of the preposition slides in to the place where he once was. So now let's make that happen. We're going to delete that red consonant, and then we're going to slide it over into the new position. So I have a red preposition, a blue definite article kind of ghost pointing, and then I have the object that appears in black, bam melech. So it's on or against the king. You'll learn that the prepositions have a variety of different translation possibilities. Let's go back to the screen together. So here, once again, you'll see in the next 2 examples, the one we just did, hamelech, prefixed with the inseparable preposition kaf, it displaces the he, and we have like the king. And I've tried to display in the colors, both in the Hebrew words and in the translations, the different features that are in each word. And finally, the woman, and then la isha, for the woman. Here you'll observe that all the spelling features of the definite article, whether you have compensatory lengthening, virtual doubling, or irregular segol vowel, will be maintained as that consonant slides over in place of the he of the definite article. So this is a fun one to see. It's a little more on the tricky side. It's kind of advanced, but you know all the different features and the spelling items that happen, and you're becoming sophisticated enough with Hebrew to see these changes and to not be taken back by them. Here's what you need to know. In Hebrew, the he is really weak, and it can drop off at the beginning of a word and at the end of a word whenever you add other things to it. So if you add a prefix to a word that begins with a he, sometimes that he can drop off. If you add a suffix to a word that ends with a he, that he will always drop off, or change. And so we need to become familiar with seeing these he's drop off and other things replace them. Now, before we move on from our discussion of the prepositions to the definite direct object marker, we want to just review that we've covered independent prepositions, makef prepositions, and then inseparable prepositions and the spelling of the inseparable prepositions. However, there's one more preposition we need to take a look at, and that's the preposition min, because it can appear as a makef preposition or prefixed to its object. So it's got 2 different spelling options. It's both a makef preposition and at times an inseparable preposition, but that nun is an important feature to see what happens. Now, let's look at our screens together. We're going to see that there are really 6 different spelling possibilities with the min preposition, but the good news is, if you've been following along and learning kind of the features of spelling changes that we've been discussing in each of the chapters, you're going to know the vast majority of the types of changes that appear here. We'll begin with the makef preposition, and we'll just observe that that's the standard way in which the min preposition is spelled: min, followed by makef, joined to its object. Now, when the min is prefixed to its object, the nun of the preposition min is going to disappear as the nun and reappear as a dagesh forte in the first consonant of the word to which it is prefixed, very much like the definite article. So the nun is lost, but a dagesh forte is added, and here's why. In Hebrew, nuns love to disappear and then reappear as a dagesh forte in the word to which they're prefixed. In addition to the preposition min being spelled as a makef preposition, it can also be spelled as an inseparable preposition, but with the dagesh forte in the consonant to which it is prefixed, like mem melech in our second example here. Here, the noon of the preposition min has assimilated as a dagesh forte into the first consonant of the word to which it's prefixed, here the object melech. Now, this is the assimilation of the noon, and the assimilation of the noon happens frequently in Hebrew in a number of different contexts and environment. And we also have this same phenomenon in English. Look at your slide with me. It is common in English to add the prefix in to a word in order to negate it or reverse its meaning. So, for example, we can add the prefix in to the English word definite, and that renders indefinite or not definite. You can see the prefix in on the word definite, which means now not definite. We can do the same thing with the word correct. We can add the prefix in to the word correct, and we get incorrect, which is now meaning not correct. Again, you can see the prefix in on the front of the English word correct. In both of those first two examples, the n does not assimilate. You can see its full spelling on the word indefinite and incorrect. But let's look at the next two examples together. When we want to add in to the word moral, you would think we might get immoral with the in prefix, but we get immoral. In this instance, the n of the in prefix has changed to m to match the first letter of the word moral. The n has assimilated to an m to match moral. This is the assimilation of the n in English. Let's look at the second example. In plus legal is now rendered illegal. In this case, the n of the in prefix has become l. It has assimilated to the l of legal. This is the assimilation of n in English, and this is exactly what happens in Hebrew, except in Hebrew, the noon will assimilate not as another letter, but as a dagesh forte. So let's go back to our screen and look at the subsequent examples of the min being prefixed to its object. We already took a look at the second example, mem melech, where the min is prefixed to melech and that noon reappears or assimilates as a dagesh forte into the mem of melech. Now in our third example, mebayeth, the noon has prefixed to a word that begins with a begad kafat, so that dagesh lene that was originally in the begad kafat becomes a dagesh forte. You've already seen that with the spelling of the definite article. We also can experience compensatory lengthening in example 4 with me'ir. Here the noon of the preposition min wanted to assimilate as a dagesh forte in the ayin, but ayin is a guttural. The ayin has rejected the dagesh forte, and the hirik has lengthened to sere. The short I has lengthened to the long E. This is another pattern of compensatory lengthening. We've already seen pathic lengthened to comets. Now we're seeing hirik lengthened to sere, but you already know the phenomenon compensatory lengthening. In our fifth example, mechutz, the noon has attempted to assimilate into the chet, but that guttural consonant has rejected the dagesh forte. In this case, however, there's no lengthening of the hirik, and that you already know as virtual doubling or virtual no doubling and no compensatory lengthening. And finally, it's important to observe in our sixth example that the preposition min, when prefixed to its object, does not displace the hey of the definite article. It's a completely different environment. That noon has attempted to assimilate into the hey of the definite article, but it can't, and so it won't displace it. But that hey rejects the dagesh forte of the noon, and you get the sere spelling of the E-class vowel because of compensatory lengthening. So those are the 6 different spelling options for the makef preposition min. Once again, it's important to know the variety of forms in which it appears, but it's more important to know the rules that govern that the noon will assimilate as a dagesh forte, and that you can get compensatory lengthening or virtual doubling, and it won't displace the hey because of the dagesh forte. There's one more item to cover in this chapter, and that's the issue of the definite direct object marker, frequently abbreviated DDOM because it's a mouthful to say definite direct object marker every time. And some grammars prefer to call it the accusative particle. And here's what the definite direct object marker is. In Hebrew, definite direct objects are usually marked with eth or eth. This word is never translated. Now what does that mean? There are a few words in Hebrew that have no translation value but only kind of mark grammatical functions. One of those words is the definite direct object marker. It doesn't have any semantic value. It has only grammatical value. And what it's doing is it's telling you that the word that follows is the object of the verb and the definite direct object of the verb. Now, a verbal object is that which receives the action of the verb, and we'll talk more about that in chapters 12 and following. When the object of a verb is definite, and it's the direct object of that verb, it can be marked by this particle, the accusative particle or the definite direct object marker. So let's look at our examples here, just to show you what's going on. The first word there, bara, is the word for create, and the second word, Elohim, is the subject of that verb. So God created. Now, what did God create? He created the heavens. The word the heavens is the definite direct object of the verb. It's the direct object because it's what God created, and it's the definite direct object because it's got the definite article on it. Because of that, it's marked by the definite direct object marker. We don't translate that particle at all. It just marks the fact that the word that follows is the definite direct object of the verb. Now, when it marks something that's a definite direct object of the verb, there are three different kinds of objects that can be definite. Proper names are considered to be definite, and they don't need the definite article to be definite. So the Hebrew word right there, Yehonathan, or Jonathan, is the definite direct object of the verb ahav. Here we have ahav, Dawid, eth Yehonathan. David loved Jonathan. Because Jonathan is the definite direct object of the verb to love, it's marked with a definite direct object marker. Finally, the last category that can be a definite direct object are nouns with pronominal suffixes. Now, we have not studied nouns with pronominal suffixes, but in this particular case, the hirik yod here on the end of this word for covenant, barith, is a first common singular pronominal suffix. It means my covenant. So when a word has a pronominal suffix on it, it's also considered to be definite. So you have this expression here, wahakimothi, eth, brithi, and I will establish my covenant. So we have, just by way of review, nouns can be definite if they have the definite article. Nouns can be definite if they're proper nouns, and nouns can be definite if they have pronominal suffixes. And those types of nouns can be marked as the object of a verb with the definite direct object marker, which is never, ever translated. It has a grammatical function and never a semantic function. So when you learn this word for vocabulary, you're not going to learn a semantic definition for it, that it has a meaning like cat or dog. You're going to learn that it has a functional definition. It marks the object of the verb. That brings us to the conclusion of this chapter. And so before you move on, what should you do? First, memorize the fact that there are three types of prepositions, and then you should memorize one good example of each just to cement that in your mind. Secondly, know how to prefix inseparable prepositions to nouns. It's important to know your spelling options, and it's important to know the rules behind those options. Third, know how to prefix the preposition men to nouns, especially the way in which the noon assimilates and the way in which the assimilated noon can be rejected by guttural consonants. Finally, memorize the form and function of the definite direct object marker. It's not that hard. There's no translation value, only grammatical value. And this brings us to the conclusion of our study of prepositions and the definite direct object marker in this chapter. Welcome to the lecture for Basics of Biblical Hebrew, Chapter 7, Hebrew Adjectives. In this lecture, we will cover the forms of Hebrew adjectives, the functions of Hebrew adjectives, and then we'll finish with a directional ending. First, let's begin with some of the basics about Hebrew adjectives, both in English and in Hebrew. First, it's helpful to observe that Hebrew adjectives function just like English adjectives. They're used to modify, describe, characterize, or classify nouns. Hebrew adjectives, however, inflect in order to indicate gender and number. There's masculine singular and plural, and there's feminine singular and plural. Third, the endings for Hebrew adjectives are the same endings learned for Hebrew nouns. In fact, in terms of the spelling of Hebrew adjectives, you already know every principle that's to be used or employed in their inflection both masculine and feminine, and singular and plural. So in terms of spelling, there's nothing new to learn in this chapter. We're going to simply review and reinforce what you already know into a new context, the context of adjectives. Let's begin by looking together at the Hebrew adjective paradigm. The basic inflection of the Hebrew adjective occurs in the categories masculine and feminine, both singular and plural, just like our noun paradigm. And we're going to go over these forms together now. The first one is tov, the masculine singular, tovim, the masculine plural, tova, the feminine singular, and tovoth, the feminine plural. You'll notice and observe that the masculine singular form is endingless, but the masculine plural form ends in im. The feminine singular form ends in the comet he that's characteristic of feminine singular nouns. And the feminine plural form ends in oath, the feminine plural ending you learned with nouns. Now, in each case, these adjectives, whether they are masculine or feminine, singular or plural, they carry with them the same basic translation value. For this particular adjective, tov, it means good. And whether it's masculine or feminine, singular or plural, it's always translated as good, regardless of the form. Let's now look at the different patterns of adjectival inflection before we talk about how these adjectives are used in context. The first category of adjectival inflection are adjectives that have no change in spelling when you inflect them or when you add the feminine or plural endings to them. Here is the same noun we just encountered, tov, tovim, tova, tovoth. You'll observe that the basic form of the adjective tov with the tet, the holomau, and the bait does not change. So monosyllabic nouns spelled with an unchangeable long vowel will never change when you add inflectional endings to them, and that's what this first example represents. Our second example here is tzaddik. Notice that this is a two-syllable noun, but the second root letter has a dogish forte in it. So you have two closed syllables. The first syllable, tzad, is closed and unaccented, so it has a short vowel. The second syllable, dik, is closed and accented, so it has the long vowel, in this case, the unchangeable long vowel. Because that first syllable is protected by that dogish forte in the second root letter, it's never going to reduce beyond that short vowel, and so it won't change. So you have tzaddik, but then the masculine plural, tzaddikim, the feminine singular, tzaddikah, and the feminine plural, tzaddikoth. Again, these are adjectives that are inflected with no change in the basic spelling or lexical form. The second category of adjectival inflection consists of adjectives that will experience propretonic reduction when they are inflected in the feminine or plural forms. Let's look at our first example here. We have the two-syllable noun gadol. You can see that in the masculine plural form, gadolim, the comets under the gimel has changed to a vocal schwa. This is an instance of propretonic reduction, just like we saw with the nouns. It shouldn't cause you any trouble with spelling because you've already seen it with nouns. Now you see it applied to adjectives in the very same way. Propretonic reduction, a very common phenomenon in Biblical Hebrew. The same will apply to gadolah and gadoloth. The one spelling feature that changes between the masculine singular form and all the other forms is the simple instance of propretonic reduction under the first syllable. Now, in our second example below, chakam, we're going to observe that we get propretonic reduction in each of the first syllables, but that because this word begins with a guttural, you can't have the regular vocal schwa, and so you get the hatef pathic. This is one of the three basic characteristics of the guttural consonants that we learned way back in chapter 3. Adjectives that end in sagol he constitute their own special class, but again, we've already covered this with nouns. You know that there's a certain class of masculine singular nouns that end in sagol he. And whenever those nouns are inflected, or whenever those nouns were inflected, they dropped that sagol he and took the inflectional endings. The same thing occurs here with adjectives that end in sagol he. In our example here, kasheh, you'll see that the masculine singular form ends in that characteristic sagol he that marks this class. But in the masculine plural form, kashim, you'll see that the sagol he is dropped off and the masculine plural ending im has been added directly to the shin. Therefore, when identifying this word in context, you'll need to remember that the sagol he has fallen off before the im. The same is true for kasha, the feminine singular, and kashoth, the feminine plural. The sagol he drops off, and the inflectional ending is added directly to the shin. So this one is a little tricky, but you've already seen it happen with nouns. The same thing here will happen with adjectives. Our final category for adjectival inflection consists of the geminate adjectives. Now, you've already had geminate nouns back in chapter 4. Geminate nouns were monosyllabic nouns that were originally bisyllabic or 2 syllables, and the second root letter was originally a third root letter that was identical to the second root letter. That was why we call them the geminate or the twin nouns. Now, what you'll see here is that when adjectives are inflected for gender and number, you'll observe that the original geminate consonant returns as a doggish forte. So let's look at our first example, rav. This is originally a geminate noun that was resh, bait, where the second and third root consonants were the same. You can see in the masculine plural form you have rabim. In that particular form, there now appears a doggish forte in the bait. That is the original geminate consonant reappearing in the inflected form. The same will apply to the feminine singular, rabbah, and the feminine plural, rabboth. With these adjectives, the geminate consonant reappears in those forms that are inflected, the masculine plural, and both feminine forms, singular and plural. Now, what happens when the geminate consonant is a guttural, as in our second example down here below? Here we have resh and ayin, which was originally resh, ayin, but you can't put a doggish forte in this particular geminate consonant because the doggish forte is rejected by the guttural. So what happens is you get compensatory lengthening. In this instance, the original pathic has now become comets by way of compensatory lengthening, and there is no doggish forte in the ayin. Have you ever seen a guttural consonant reject a doggish forte? Yes. Have you ever seen compensatory lengthening from pathic to comets? Yes. So this is the application of 2 rules or patterns that you already know to this next category. There's nothing new here. We're only applying what you know to what you're seeing now. And that's the reason or the benefit for learning the system as we've been going along, by learning the reasons behind the spelling features with pluralized nouns or the definite article or the conjunction wow or how prepositions are prefixed to nouns. Those rules are just going to keep applying over and over and over again as we progress through the grammar, and you're going to be very comfortable with seeing the types of changes that appear. So those are the different patterns of inflection for adjectives. They're very simple because you've already had them back in chapter 4. Now let's consider the lexical form of an adjective. When it came to nouns, the lexical form was the singular form, either masculine or feminine. But that's not true for adjectives. The lexical form for an adjective is slightly more specific. Here it is. The lexical form for any adjective is the masculine singular form. That's the lexical form. So let's look at the examples. The lexical form for tovim, masculine plural, is tov, masculine singular. Similarly, the lexical form for tovoth, feminine plural, is also the masculine singular form tov. So regardless of whether the form is masculine plural or feminine plural, the lexical form will always be masculine singular for the adjective. Now that we've talked about the basic forms and the lexical form for Hebrew adjectives, let's talk about the 3 uses of the Hebrew adjective: attributive, predicative, and substantive. We'll begin with attributive. When an adjective is used attributively, or the attributive use of the adjective modifies a noun and agrees with that noun in gender, number, and definiteness, as the examples on the right will display. So let's look at our first example, ish tov. Here we have the masculine singular noun ish, followed by the masculine singular adjective tov. These adjectives agree in gender, masculine, number, singular, and definiteness. They're both indefinite. Also, the attributive adjective normally follows the noun that it modifies. Now, in English, the attributive adjectives will precede the noun. We like to say a good man, but in Hebrew, they like to say a man, a good one. All right, so it's going to be backwards. So you're going to have to not only translate the words, but translate the syntax kind of back into what English would be. So here again, we have ish tov. The adjective follows the noun that it modifies. Let's look at our second example, ha-ish, hatov. Here we have the man, the good, or better in English, the good man. Notice how the adjective, hatov, follows the noun that it modifies, and it agrees in gender, they're both masculine, number, they're both singular, and definiteness, they both have the definite article. In this case, notice how the definite article appears twice, first here and then again on the adjective, but it's only rendered once in translation. The good man. We don't say the good, the man in English, just once. In our third example, we now have Isha Tova, a good woman. Once again, the attributive adjective follows the noun that it modifies, and it agrees in gender, number, and definiteness. In this case, feminine, singular, both indefinite. And finally, our last example, Ha'isha Hatova, the good woman. Notice that they agree in gender, number, and definiteness. They're both feminine and singular and definite. And again, the attributive adjective follows the noun that it modifies. And once again, just to reinforce this fact, even though there are two definite articles in this construction, literally the woman, the good one, in English we're just going to render it with a single definite article, the good woman. By way of quick review, the attributive adjective will directly modify the noun. It will agree in gender, number, and definiteness and follow the noun that it goes with. The second use of the adjective is the predicative use. In the predicative use, the adjective asserts something about the noun and agrees in gender and number with that noun, but not in definiteness. So the nouns will agree in gender and number like masculine and singular, but the adjective will be indefinite and the noun will be definite. Let's look at our examples together. In our first example, we have Tov Ha'ish or Ha'ish Tov. Now this is indicative of the fact that the predicative adjective can come either before or after the noun that it's associated with. Notice how they both agree in gender and number, but not in definiteness. So let's look. The adjective tov in both instances here is masculine and singular, but indefinite. There's no article with it. But the nouns, ha'ish here and ha'ish here, are masculine and singular, but they have the definite article, which means that they agree in gender and number, but not definiteness. And it's that particular environment that tells you to translate or to render this particular adjectival use as the predicate. Now, how do you render the predicative use in Hebrew? With a form of the verb to be. When an adjective predicates or asserts something about a noun, in English, we're going to use a form of the verb to be to indicate that predication. And we're normally going to begin with the subject, which is the most definite item in the pair, and then end with the adjective, which is the indefinite item in the pair. So we're going to translate this, the man is good. And that's the translation for either of those constructions, whether it's tov ha'ish or ha'ish tov. The man is good, because they agree in gender and number, but not definiteness. Let's look at our second example together. We begin with tova ha'isha. Here we have the adjective, that's feminine singular, followed by the noun, that is feminine singular and definite. Because they agree in gender and number, but not definiteness, we're going to render it predicatively, the woman is good. When we render it as the predicate, we're going to use a form of the verb to be, is, in the predication. The same is true for the example that follows. It's just in reverse order. And in Hebrew, with the predicative use, the order does not matter. It can be either adjective noun or noun adjective. And in chapter 23, we'll learn about the differences between those word orders and what they might mean for grammar and syntax. The third and final use of the adjective in Hebrew is the substantive use. And this is the case when the adjective is used independently as a noun. Let's look at our first example together. Bein tov uvein ra, between good and between evil. Here we have the adjectives tov and ra, good and evil, functioning as the object of the prepositions bein and bein. Because these adjectives are not modifying another noun or predicating something about another noun, they appear by themselves and they're used as nouns. So the substantive use of the adjective is when the adjective is used like a noun. And this is relatively common in Hebrew. In our second example, we have im hayashar, with the one who is upright. Here again, we have the adjective functioning as the object of the preposition im. It's not modifying another noun or predicating anything about a noun. So we're going to translate it as either with the upright or with the one who is upright, because it is masculine and singular. That's how the substantive use of the adjective works. So the adjective in Hebrew can either directly modify a noun attributive. It can predicate or assert something about a noun, the predicative, which is translated with the form of the verb to be, or it can function as a noun itself, as the object of the preposition, or in other kinds of instances that we'll learn later. So now you understand that there are 4 forms of the Hebrew adjective: masculine and feminine, singular and plural. You've already memorized the endings for those adjectives back in chapter 4. You also know with the different patterns of adjectival inflection that there's nothing new there to learn. You've memorized those patterns again back in chapter 4. So 4 forms, and you already know how all those forms look when they're inflected. You also understand now that there are 3 different uses for those adjectives. There's the attributive use that directly modifies a noun. There's the predicative use that asserts something about a noun. And there's the substantive use when the adjective functions as a noun. That's the basic morphology, the form, and the basic syntax or the function of adjectives in Biblical Hebrew. Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. So before we move on from this chapter, we're going to cover one more item, and that's the directional ending. Let's look together at the directional ending. So what is the directional ending? In Hebrew, a special ending may be added to a word in order to express the idea of motion towards someone or something. This special ending is the directional ending, kametze, and note that it's always unaccented. Let's look at the left side of the screen together, and you'll see what I'm talking about here. You'll observe that in the 6 examples that appear on this page, there's a kametze that's been added to the end of each word. So our first word is eretz, which means earth or land, and we've added a kametze to it, and now it means to or toward the land. Or habayatha, we have to or toward the house, or ha'ira, to or toward the city. The directional ending is in some sense functioning like the preposition el, meaning to or towards, or the lamed preposition, la. It's one more way in which Hebrew can mark direction. It's a pretty interesting particle, and you'll observe that it looks just like the feminine singular inflectional ending, both for nouns and adjectives. So we have the feminine singular noun Torah, it ends in kametze. We have the feminine singular adjective tova, it ends in kametze. And now you know that a directional ending may be added to a word in Hebrew, and that's also ends in kametze, but it's unaccented. Now you may not figure out that it's unaccented as you're looking at it initially in the Bible, but you'll know it's those words that deal with direction and location, like land or house or city or heaven or mountain or place. Those words which have a point of direction in them will appear with these words and indicate direction to or toward that item. So before you move on from this chapter, here's what you need to know and do. First, you need to memorize the inflectional endings for Hebrew adjectives, which you already know from chapter 4. That's good news. Second, you need to understand the spelling changes that occur with the inflection of Hebrew adjectives, which means this: if you're having trouble with inflecting Hebrew adjectives, it means you haven't really learned the information presented back in chapter 4, and you should probably go back there and learn that information because it's going to keep coming up as we progress through the chapters. Third, memorize the 3 uses of Hebrew adjectives, right? The attributive, the predicative, and the substantive. And don't just memorize the uses, that is those labels, but memorize what they do and how to identify those uses. And then finally, memorize the form and function of the directional ending in Hebrew, that final unaccented kametze. That's it for this chapter on Hebrew adjectives and the directional ending. Welcome to the lecture for Basics of Biblical Hebrew, Chapter 8, Hebrew Pronouns. In this lecture, we will cover personal pronouns, demonstrative pronouns, which are also demonstrative adjectives, the relative pronoun, interrogative pronouns, and the interrogative particle. Before we begin, let's consider some of the basics regarding Hebrew pronouns. A pronoun is a word that replaces a noun. You could think of them as the stunt doubles of the grammatical world. They're always filling in for a noun. The noun that a pronoun refers back to is called the antecedent. In the example, Moses was 120 years old when he died. The word he is a pronoun that refers back to Moses, the antecedent. He refers back to Moses, and so the antecedent of he is Moses. In Hebrew, there are personal, demonstrative, relative, and interrogative pronouns. Hebrew pronouns will function much like their English counterparts. Let's first consider the independent personal pronouns in Hebrew. They're called independent personal pronouns because they stand alone. They're not prefixed or they do not appear as suffixes on any other words. They're their own self-contained unit. Pretty much this list is a vocabulary list for you. You don't need to memorize the paradigm per se, but you do need to memorize the meaning of each form. Let's look at the screen together and pronounce these words. The third masculine singular form is who. The third feminine singular form is he. Notice that there are two possible spellings for the third feminine singular form. The first one occurs throughout the Hebrew Bible except in the Pentateuch. The second one occurs exclusively in the Pentateuch. The second masculine singular form, atah. The second feminine singular form, at. And then the first common singular form, ani, or anoki. Once again, notice there are two forms for the first common singular. Let's move to the plural column. The third masculine plural is pronounced haim or hema. The third feminine plural is pronounced hain or haina. Once again, notice that for the three MP and the three FP, there are two different possible spellings. For the second masculine plural form, we have atem, the second feminine plural form, atena, and the first common plural form, anachnu. Those are the forms of the independent personal pronouns. I'll read them once again quickly. Who, he, ata, at. Ani, anochi. Now the plural. Haim, hema. Hain, hena. Atem, atena, anachnu. Now let's consider the grammar of the independent personal pronouns. By way of review, once again, independent personal pronouns are labeled independent because they stand alone and are not prefixed to another word. Additionally, independent personal pronouns are subjective, meaning they are used as the subject of the verb, never as the object of a verb. Personal pronouns may also appear as the subject of a verbless clause. So these pronouns are subjective. They are not possessive and they are not objective. We'll learn possessive and objective pronouns in the next chapter. The independent personal pronouns are only subjective. They will occur only as the subject of a verb or as the subject of a verbless clause. Well, let's consider the independent personal pronouns in verbless clauses as one way of considering how they're used in context. We'll cover them with verbs when we get to verbs in chapter 12. In Hebrew, a to be clause does not require the verb to be like it does in English. You can have a to be clause in Hebrew without the verb. Personal pronouns frequently appear in these verbless to be clause. You have to supply the verb to be in your translation into English. So let's consider the independent personal pronouns on the screen together. In our first example, ani Yahweh, we have the independent personal pronoun 1CS followed by the divine name, I am Yahweh. In example 2, we have the 3MS personal pronoun who followed by Navi Tzaddik. He is a righteous prophet. Notice that in these first two examples, there's no form of the verb to be. We're supplying that from the context because these are verbless clauses in Hebrew. In English, we don't have verbless clauses, so we're adding that verb each time. In our third example, Ata Melech Tov. You, second masculine singular, are a good king. Our fourth example, you'll observe, Achim Anachnu. Here the independent personal pronoun is second and the noun is first. Word order in verbless clauses of this type is variable. And so you can have either the independent personal pronoun followed by the noun or the noun followed by the independent personal pronoun. In English, we usually begin with the independent personal pronoun followed by the rest of the sentence. In our fourth example, we have he, isha, chakama. She is a wise woman. And finally, in our last example, atem ba'ir hagadolah. You are in the great city. In these examples, you see independent personal pronouns in verbless clauses. Let's move on to the demonstrative pronouns and adjectives. We'll just call them demonstratives for now. There are two sets of demonstratives. This, these, those are the near demonstratives in the upper register. And then the lower register, we have that and those. Those are called the far demonstratives. Let's begin by reading the singular forms in the left side. We have the masculine singular, ze, the feminine singular, zoth, the masculine singular, hu, and the feminine singular, he. In the plural category, we have the masculine plural, Ela, and the feminine plural, Ela. Both the masculine plural and the feminine plural forms are identical, meaning they are common in terms of gender, either masculine or feminine. And then finally we have in the plural category, Haim, Hema, Hain, Haina. You'll observe that in this lower register of demonstratives, they are the same form as the independent personal pronouns. So when you see one of these words, you'll have to determine from context if it's an independent personal pronoun or a demonstrative. We'll review that in a second. Let's consider the grammar of the demonstratives together. Hebrew demonstratives may be used either as adjectives, this man, those women, or as pronouns, this is the man, those are the women. Once again, the masculine and feminine forms, who and he, are identical to the third person masculine and feminine independent personal pronouns, as well as the plural ones, but these singular ones occur much more commonly. Finally, the demonstrative Ela is both masculine and feminine plural. Remember that the designation for this phenomenon is common, meaning not inflected for gender. Let's look at a demonstrative adjective and see how that's used in context. When a Hebrew demonstrative is functioning as an adjective, it will follow the noun it modifies and agree in gender, number, and definiteness. This is exactly like the regular adjective we learned in a previous chapter. Let's consider our 4 examples together. Our first example is Ha'ish Hazeh, this man. Notice that the noun in first position is masculine, singular, and definite, and so the demonstrative that follows must also be masculine, singular, and definite. Now, if you were to translate this literally from Hebrew, it would be the man, the this. But we don't render it that way into English. We don't use the definite articles, and we translate in some sense backwards. We begin with the demonstrative, and then we finish with the noun. Let's look at our second example. Ha'isha hazoth, literally, the woman, the this. But in English, we're going to render it this woman. Once again, we start with the demonstrative, we finish with the noun, and we don't use the definite article. Ha'ish hahu, literally the man, the that, but in English, that man. And finally, ha'isha hahi, that woman. When a demonstrative is functioning like an adjective, it will agree in gender, number, and definiteness with the noun that it's modifying, and it will follow that noun. What happens when a noun is modified by both an attributive adjective and a demonstrative adjective? Here's what happens. All 3 must agree in gender, number, and definiteness. Let's look at our 2 examples together. The first example, Ha'ish hatov hazeh, literally, the man, the good, the this. In this case, we're going to translate it into English, this good man. The noun, the adjective, and the demonstrative all agree in gender, number, and definiteness. They're all masculine, singular, and definiteness. Once again, we're going to translate this backwards. We'll begin with the demonstrative, we'll move to the adjective, and then we'll render the noun, this good man. Notice that we don't render the definite article in any of the translation. Consider the second example, Ha'isha hatova hazoth. Here we have this good woman. Once again, the noun is followed by the adjective, which is followed by the demonstrative, and they all agree in gender, number, and definiteness. They're all feminine, singular, and definite. The demonstrative adjective functions just like the regular adjective in Hebrew. Let's consider now how a demonstrative functions like a pronoun. When a Hebrew demonstrative is functioning as a pronoun, it will precede the noun and agree in gender and number, but not in definiteness. This is like the predicative use of the adjective in the previous chapters. Consider these following examples. We begin with Zeh ha'ish. This is the man. The demonstrative Zeh is in first position, and it's masculine and singular. The noun that follows is masculine, singular, and definite. So the demonstrative and the noun agree in gender and number, masculine and singular, but not in definiteness. The demonstrative does not have the definite article, the noun does. This creates a verbless clause, once again, in Hebrew. This is the man. In our next example, Zoth ha'isha, this is the woman. Once again, the demonstrative and the noun agree in gender and number, feminine and singular, but not definiteness. The noun isha is definite with the definite article, but the demonstrative does not appear with the definite article. In our third example, we have hu ha'ish, that is the man. Here we have the demonstrative in first position and the definite noun that follows, and they agree in gender and number. Finally, he ha'isha, that is the woman. Notice that in each instance, the demonstrative appears in the first position and is indefinite. The noun follows and appears with a definite article. The way to distinguish between the demonstrative as an adjective and a demonstrative as a pronoun is its position, does it precede or follow the noun, and the absence or presence of the definite article on that demonstrative. If the demonstrative is first without the article, it's a demonstrative pronoun. If the article is second with the article, it's a demonstrative adjective. So you have to know both the meaning of these words and the grammar that supports their usage. We now move to the relative pronoun in Hebrew. This is one of my favorite Hebrew words, and I'll let you know why in just a moment. Let's consider some of the facts about the relative pronoun in both Hebrew and English. First, the major relative pronouns in English are who, whom, whose, that, and which. We have a bunch of relative pronouns in English. A relative pronoun introduces a relative clause that modifies a noun. A relative clause is composed of the relative pronoun and the clause that it introduces. You can think of a relative pronoun and its clause as a giant adjective, and it's going to modify a noun. Finally, the form of the Hebrew relative pronoun never changes in its 5,503 occurrences in the Hebrew Bible. Hallelujah. One of the things you've observed about Hebrew so far is that words love to change or alter their spelling. They love to take prefixes, they love to take suffixes, and when they take prefixes or suffixes, the accent and syllable structure changes, and so the internal spelling of the word changes, the vowels change. The relative pronoun never, ever changes. It's a frozen form. It's your friend in Hebrew. It's one of those words you can always rely on. So let's see how the relative pronoun is used in context. Now, we said that the relative pronoun introduces a relative clause, and normally that relative clause modifies a noun, and those are the examples we have here. Let's take a couple of these examples together. In our first example, we have ha'etz asher bathok hagan, the tree that is in the middle of the garden. The relative clause is asher bathok hagan. That relative clause functions like an adjective and modifies the noun ha'etz, the tree. Which tree? The tree that is in the midst of the garden. Our second example, Heharim asher tachath hashemayim, the mountains that are under the heavens. Here we have the relative clause asher tachath hashemayim, modifying the masculine plural form of mountain or mountains. What mountains? The mountains that are under the heaven. The relative clause is modifying the noun mountains. In our fourth example, we have Hamelech asher bachartem, the king whom you chose. Here we have a relative clause modifying the word king. Finally, we have Dawid asher baveth Yahweh, David, who is in the house of the Lord or in the house of Yahweh. The relative clause asher baveth Yahweh is modifying the noun Dawid. The relative pronoun, asher, does not change its form to match in gender and number or definiteness with the noun that it's modifying. It's a frozen form. Let's move on to our next category of pronoun, the interrogative pronouns. The interrogative pronouns are used to ask questions. So we have me for who and ma for what. They may appear with or without the makef. The spelling of me never changes. The spelling of the interrogative ma, however, follows the general pattern of the definite article. It'll be ma, meh, or meh with the dogish forte in the next word. Let's look at some examples of the interrogative pronoun in Hebrew. Our first three examples deal with the interrogative ma, meaning what? Ma shemo, what is his name? Ma chalom hazeh, what is this dream? And meh asitha, what have you done? Notice that there are three spelling options here for the interrogative ma. The first one looks more like the definite article. The second one is due to compensatory lengthening and the rejection of the dogish forte. And the third one is disassimilation because of the ayin comets. The rules that govern the spelling of the interrogative here are the same rules that govern the spelling of the definite article. In our second set of examples, we're dealing with the interrogative me, meaning who. Mi ata, who are you? Mi ha'ish hazeh, who is this man? Or mi ha'anashim ha'ela, who are these men? You can see here that in each instance, the interrogative me does not change its spelling. Some of the forms of the interrogative may be connected by makef, others are not. Having covered independent, demonstrative, relative, and interrogative pronouns, before we conclude this chapter, we're going to consider one more particle, if you will, that is related to the interrogative. This is called the interrogative particle. If you look at your screen with me, you'll see the interrogative particle, and this particle is prefixed to the first word of a sentence. What it does is it turns a statement into a question, and it's spelled in one of three ways. Before most consonants, it's spelled hey with a hatef pathic. But if it's prefixed to a word that begins with a guttural or any consonant with a schwa, it's going to be spelled with the simple pathic. And before gutturals with com, it's hey segol due to disassimilation. It's easier to look at some examples here with me on your screen. In our first example, we have the statement Zoth ha'ir, this is the city. You can see that in the second example, we've prefixed the interrogative pronoun to Zoth. This changes the statement into a question. So now we will translate Hazoth ha'ir as is this the city. You can think of the interrogative particle as the equivalent of the English question mark. In our second example, we have Shalak, Hamelech, Eth, Hanavi. The king sent the prophet. We change that statement into a question by prefixing the interrogative particle to the exact same sentence. Now we don't have a statement, the king sent the prophet. We have a question, did the king send the prophet? So instead of the question mark appearing at the end of an English sentence, the interrogative appears at the beginning of a question in Hebrew. Now, because the hey of the interrogative particle is similar to the hey of the definite article, we want to consider the distinct spelling differences. First, the hatef pathic of the interrogative particle is not the spelling of the definite article, which consists of hey, pathic, and dagesh forte. Remember that dagesh forte is an important part of the spelling of the definite article. The interrogative particle does not normally have the dagesh forte that is associated then with the definite article. And finally, the interrogative particle is normally prefixed to verbs, the negative particles, or prepositions. The definite article will not appear with these parts of speech. You'll also remember that the definite article appears some 25,000 times in the Hebrew Bible. So when in doubt, begin by guessing the definite article. Before we conclude, let's briefly consider the top 10 interrogatives in the Hebrew Bible. You'll see that at the top of the list is the interrogative particle itself, occurring 664 times. This is followed by the interrogative ma, meaning what, and mi, meaning who. We also have lama, which is a combination of the lamed preposition and the interrogative what, meaning for what, or now here, why, and then madua, meaning why. We have ek, meaning how, and aya, meaning where. All of these words appear more than 50 times, and they're worth memorizing. There are a few less common interrogatives, mathai meaning when, ana meaning where, and a meaning where. You can see that there aren't that many interrogatives in Hebrew, and so concentrate on the ones that occur with greater frequency. Finally, before you move on, what should you do? First, carefully memorize all of the pronouns that appear in the vocabulary section of this chapter. By and large, the bulk or the freight of the work in this chapter is memorizing as vocabulary all of the pronouns that you've just encountered. Then, you need to become familiar with the basic grammar associated with independent, demonstrative, relative, and interrogative pronouns. You'll need to know, for example, that independent pronouns are subjective, or that demonstrative pronouns can be demonstrative pronouns or adjectives, and when to tell the difference, and how to tell the difference between the two. Finally, you want to know how the relative pronoun works and how it modifies nouns, and how the interrogative pronouns work and the interrogative particle. That's it for Chapter 8, the Hebrew pronouns. Welcome to the lecture for Basics of Biblical Hebrew, Chapter 9, Pronominal Suffixes. Now, in the last chapter, we covered independent personal pronouns, and those pronouns were subjective. That is, they appear as the subject of a verb or the subject of a verbless clause. In this chapter, we're going to cover pronominal suffixes, and these pronominal suffixes are going to be the objective or possessive pronouns. In this lecture, then, we will cover the form and translation of pronominal suffixes in Hebrew. Then we will also look at how pronominal suffixes attach to nouns, prepositions, and the definite direct object marker. Pronominal suffixes, let's consider the basics together. First, pronominal suffixes are pronouns that are attached to nouns, prepositions, the definite direct object marker, and verbs, and we'll study their attachment to verbs later. Pronominal suffixes are either possessive, as in my, your, his, her, our, their, or objective, me, you, him, her, us, them. When appearing on nouns, pronominal suffixes are possessive, his book or her wisdom. When appearing on prepositions, the definite direct object marker, or verbs, pronominal suffixes are objective, to them or simply them. Once again, pronominal suffixes are going to be either objective or possessive, depending on what they're attached to. Some more of the basics. All pronominal suffixes have person. They're going to be first, second, or third person. They also have gender. They're going to be masculine, feminine, or common. And then they have number. They're going to be singular or plural. In Hebrew, there are two sets of pronominal suffixes. There's the type 1 set and the type 2 set. Both sets have the same possessive or objective translation values. In general, type 1 suffixes appear with singular nouns and the definite direct object marker. Type 2 suffixes appear with plural nouns. Prepositions, however, can take either type 1 or type 2 pronominal suffixes. Let's look at a few pronominal suffixes and consider their translation together. With nouns, pronominal suffixes are possessive. So consider this first example, kolo, his voice. The pronominal suffix is attached to the noun and appears in red. It's the 3ms pronominal suffix, his. With prepositions, the translation value is objective. In our second example, lo, the pronominal suffix which appears in red is attached directly to the preposition lamed, to him. Notice how the objective value of the preposition is rendered as opposed to the subjective value in the first example, his voice. His versus him, possessive versus objective. And then finally, with the definite direct object marker, the rendering of the preposition is objective. So here we have the definite direct object marker, otho, with the 3ms pronominal suffix. And of course, you don't render the definite direct object marker in translation, so we just render the pronoun him. Now we'll talk more about that later when we see the whole set of pronominal suffixes, but this is just a basic introduction to how pronominal suffixes are rendered as either the objective or possessive values. Let's look now at the pronominal suffixes, both type 1 and type 2. On the screen, you now see two sets of pronominal suffixes. Type 1 pronominal suffixes in the left column and type 2 pronominal suffixes in the right column, followed by both possessive or objective translation values. They are arranged by person, gender, and number, beginning with third person, masculine singular, moving to the third feminine singular, then the second person, masculine and feminine singular, and then the first person, common singular. The bottom 5 forms are plural, third masculine plural, third feminine plural, moving to the second person, second masculine plural, second feminine plural, and then first common plural. In English, we normally move in terms of person, gender, and number from first person to second person to third person. But in Hebrew, we begin with third person, move to second person, and then with first person, both singular and plural. And we'll do this for prepositions and verbs and any other types of paradigms that we encounter like this. There's the type 1 set in the left column and the type 2 set in the right column. There are numerous spelling similarities between the type 1 and the type 2 pronominal suffixes, but each of the type 2 pronominal suffixes in this right column begins with a yod. In the type 1 column on the left, you'll observe that only one pronominal suffix, the 1cs, has a yod in its spelling. This chart does not necessarily need to be memorized at this time, but you will need to become familiar with the forms of the pronominal suffixes and how they're attached to nouns, which is what we're going to consider now. Later, I'll give you a particular paradigm that's the most helpful one to learn for memorizing the pronominal suffixes. On the screen now, you'll see that certain type 1 suffixes have an alternate form. The normal type 1 suffix appears in the left column. The alternate form appears in the right column. Once again, there's going to be similarity between the type 1 suffix and the alternate form, and you'll need to memorize these alternatives. Begin with the 3ms. The whole and wow is spelled who in the alternate form. In the 3fs form, ah becomes ha. In the 1cs form, we have a noon added, so e becomes ni. In the 3mp form, hem drops the hey and changes the vowel to comets, so hem becomes And finally, the 3fp form, hen, does the same thing that the 3mp form does. It drops the hey and changes the vowel to comets on. Once again, you'll need to memorize these forms, but not now. We'll do it later. It is important to observe that type 1 and type 2 suffixes are similar to one another. Note, however, that all type 2 suffixes have yod as part of their spelling. Now, we said that before, but we're going to point it out here in detail. You can see that in the first example on the left, we have the noun sus with a 1cp pronominal suffix, meaning our horse. In the type 2 example on the right, we still have the noun sus, horse, but we have the type 2 pronominal suffix, our horses. The only difference in spelling between the type 1 and the type 2 pronominal suffix is the presence of this yod between the noun and the pronominal suffix. Now, type 2 pronominal suffixes are attached to plural nouns, and so we know to render sus as our horses, not singularly as our horse. Let's look at how pronominal suffixes are attached to masculine nouns. On the screen, you'll see two paradigms of pronominal suffixes attached to the noun sus, meaning horse. In the left column, we're going to see pronominal suffixes attached to singular nouns, and in the right column, we're going to see pronominal suffixes attached to plural nouns. Let's work through some of these together to see how they work. We begin with a 3ms in the left column, suso, his horse, or you could render it the horse of him, but in English, we prefer to use the possessive pronoun his horse. Susa, her horse. Susecha, your horse. Susech, your horse. Susi, my horse. The pronominal suffixes, when attached to nouns, appear at the end of the noun and are translated with a possessive value. Let's consider some of the type 2 forms. Susau, his horses. Suseha, her horses. Susecha, your horses. Susayak, your horses. And susai, my horses. One of the things that you'll observe in the plural paradigm, both the upper register and this lower register, is that the masculine plural ending im has dropped. The only way to tell that a noun with a pronominal suffix is plural is by the use of the type 2 pronominal suffixes. Let's look at that more closely. Pronominal suffixes are added directly to masculine singular nouns. Nothing is lost when the noun takes the pronominal suffix. With masculine plural nouns, however, the plural ending is dropped before the suffix is added. So you can see in our two examples below, on the left we have suso, his horse, and on the right we have susau, his horses. Both suffixes are third masculine singular and are rendered possessively as his. But with the first example, sus the noun is singular, and with the second example, sus the noun is rendered as plural horses because it takes a type 2 pronominal suffix. It's very important to remember that when a masculine plural noun takes a pronominal suffix, it drops the im ending and takes the type 2 pronominal suffix. Finally, with pronominal suffixes attached to masculine singular nouns, be careful to note the important difference in spelling between the 1CS type 1 and the 1CS type 2 suffixes. The only difference is the vowel that appears under the last letter of the noun to which it's suffixed. So in our first example, the type 1 susi, we have my horse, and in the second example, we have the type 2 susai, my horses. In the first example, we have a heric yod that is the 1CS type 1 suffix. But in our second example, susai, we have a pathic yod as the 1CS type 2 suffix. This distinction is very important because one of them, susi, is singular and the other, susai, is plural. At first, these two forms can be easily confused. Let's look at how to attach pronominal suffixes to feminine nouns now. Let's begin by pronouncing some of these forms together to get a sense for how they look and feel. Toratho, his law. Toratha, her law. Toratheka, your law. Torathek, your law. And Torathi, my law. You'll observe on the screen that when a pronominal suffix is added to a feminine singular noun that ends in comma te, the he has to change to tau before the suffix. You'll recall that he is a very weak consonant, and whenever it appears at the end of the word and something is added to it, it's either going to drop off or strengthen into a tau. In this case, a comets he will strengthen to a comets tau before the pronominal suffix with feminine nouns. Now, this is an important feature to memorize because you'll have to look up this word in the lexicon at points, and you'll need to reconstruct that tau back into a he. Let's look at the plural forms. Torathau, Toratheha, Toratheka, Torathiac, and Torathai. What you'll see here is that the feminine plural endings are stable and do not drop off. The pronominal suffix is added directly to the full feminine plural form. So the feminine plural is going to look plural in two ways. One, it's going to maintain the feminine plural inflectional ending oath, but it's also going to take a type 2 pronominal suffix. Now this is different from the masculine plural. Remember, the masculine plural noun dropped the ending and added the suffix. The feminine plural noun keeps the ending and takes the suffix. So you'll have to remember which nouns do what when they take the pronominal suffix. Let's consider this more closely. With feminine singular nouns ending in comets he, the he changes to tau before the suffix is added. Feminine plural nouns retain the full feminine plural ending. This is an important point and must be reviewed. In our first example, toratho, you can see the blue tau. That is the strengthened he of Torah. It's followed by the 3ms pronominal suffix his law. In our second example, torathau, we see the full oath ending of the feminine plural in blue, followed by the full type 2 pronominal suffix, that's 3ms, his laws. Let me review it this way. When you add pronominal suffixes to masculine singular nouns, nothing happens. You just add the suffix to the noun, and there will probably be some spelling changes in the noun itself. When you add a pronominal suffix to a masculine plural noun, you drop the plural ending and add the type 2 suffix. When you add pronominal suffixes to a feminine singular noun, you change the comets he into a tau and add a type 1 suffix. And when you add pronominal suffixes to a feminine plural noun, you're going to keep the full feminine plural ending and add the type 2 suffix. So it's going to be very important that you memorize what happens to what nouns when they take pronominal suffixes. Now, the majority of nouns will experience vowel changes with the addition of suffixes. Most of these vowel changes are predictable and follow prescribed rules, as the examples below illustrate. Now, if you've been tracking in the grammar with how we've been presenting the material, you've learned in Chapter 3, for example, the 5 rules for vowel preferences inside certain syllables. You've learned about propretonic reduction. You've learned about rule of schwa 1, rule of schwa 2. And all of these rules are now going to apply to how vowels change when a noun takes a pronominal suffix. Remember, when you add something to the end of a word, it's going to change the accent and syllable structure of that word. And when you change the accent and syllable structure of that word, vowel changes may occur. However, you've become so accustomed to seeing these vowel changes, most of them are predictable and should be no problem for you to identify and understand in context. Let's look at some of these forms together. In our first example, davari, meaning my word, you will observe that the original comets under the dalet has reduced to vocal schwa because of propretonic reduction, and I know you've seen and encountered propretonic reduction before. In our second example, divrehen, their words, you're going to have propretonic reduction in the first 2 syllables under the dalet and under the bait, and then the application of rule of schwa 1, their words again. With our third noun, avdo, the seglet noun eved changes its vocalization, and I'll explain this in Chapter 10. With our third example, beitecha, your house, the ay diphthong changes to sere yod. This is an important change to understand, and you'll see it with some frequency in the Hebrew Bible. Similarly, in our last example, motho, the aw diphthong changes to whole and wow when a pronominal suffix is added. Again, this is another important change to remember, and we'll explain that again more fully in Chapter 10. Before we move on, we want to consider how pronominal suffixes are added to a variety of different words, just to avoid confusion, to clarify certain things. You have to memorize any of these paradigms or forms. You just need to become aware of the phenomenon that I'll point out in each instance. Let's briefly consider how pronominal suffixes are added to certain monosyllabic nouns. Now, what you'll observe in the left-hand column, the type 1 column, is a hierarchic yod that appears between the noun and the pronominal suffix in every form. This is because, in Hebrew, certain singular monosyllabic nouns will add hierarchic yod before the pronominal suffix. This is actually an old genitive case ending that has been preserved in very common forms, because that which is most common, remember, is most irregular. Now, you need to realize that this hierarchic yod may cause you to think of it as a type 2 suffix, because if you look in this right-hand column, in the type 2 category, the plural verbs don't add this hierarchic yod, but in all the type 2 spellings, there is a yod present. So be careful that you don't confuse the hierarchic yod in these monosyllabic nouns with the yod of the type 2 noun. What about pronominal suffixes with prepositions? Pronominal suffixes with prepositions can take either type 1 or type 2 pronominal suffixes without any change in meaning. And most prepositions just prefer, for example, type 1 or type 2. They won't mix it up. In the first column on the left, we see the preposition lamed with the type 1 pronominal suffixes and the preposition al with type 2 pronominal suffixes. Now, at this point, I want to pause and say, if you're going to memorize any paradigm for the pronominal suffixes in Hebrew, the paradigm on the left with the lamed preposition is the one to memorize. This will give you kind of the basic contours and spelling of each of the pronominal suffixes with the preposition lamed, which is easy to spell and maintain throughout. For that reason, let's work through this paradigm together and pronounce each form. Lo, la, lecha, lach, li, lahem, lahen, lakem, laken, and lanu. I found that when most students memorize this paradigm, they're able to correctly identify, in terms of person, gender, and number, pronominal suffixes in Biblical Hebrew. You've got to give yourself some anchor point, and this is perhaps the best anchor point to begin memorizing these pronominal suffixes. Let's look next at pronominal suffixes with the prepositions kaf, or ka, and min. The reason we want to do this is because the preposition kaf and the preposition min have slightly different spellings in some of the forms when they take pronominal suffixes. So look at your screen with me, and you'll see with the preposition kaf in the left column that highlighted in red is a longer spelling of the preposition, not just kaf or ka, but kamo. And to that, the pronominal suffix is added. So kamo hu, kamo ha, kamo cha, kamoch, and kamo ni. Then finally, kamonu down at the 1CP. The third masculine plural, the third feminine plural, the second masculine plural, and the second feminine plural are all spelled with the simple kaf consonant. The other forms have a longer form or a longer spelling. So you need to memorize that and become comfortable with it. Similarly, the preposition min in the singular and 1CP have a longer form identified or highlighted in red. Memenu, memena, mimecha, mimech, memeni, and then down here, memenu. It's also helpful to observe that the 3ms pronominal suffix and the 1CP pronominal suffix in these forms are identical. And so you want to make sure that you are able to distinguish those forms in context. Let's look at how pronominal suffixes are attached to the definite direct object marker. The definite direct object marker, eith or eth, takes type 1 pronominal suffixes which are translated in the objective case. Now remember, the definite direct object marker is never translated. It's a function or a grammatical word. It's telling you that what follows is the object of the verb. And a pronoun or pronominal suffix can function as the object of the verb, and it's considered definite. So in the example that we have here, B'Tselem Elohim bara otho, you can see at the end here the definite direct object marker appearing with a 3ms pronominal suffix. Well, let's look then at the full set of pronominal suffixes with the definite direct object marker and the preposition eith. Now, you'll recall from vocabulary that the definite direct object marker and the preposition eith have the same spelling when there's no suffix with them. When they take suffixes, however, their spelling is distinct, and it's important to know that. If you look in this left-hand column, you'll see pronominal suffixes attached to the definite direct object marker. And in each instance, the definite direct object marker is spelled as oath or with an O-class vowel. The only exception is with ethkim and ethkin in the 2MP and 2FP. Now let's look at the forms in the right column where the pronominal suffixes are attached to the preposition eighth, meaning with. And you'll observe that in each instance, the preposition is spelled with a heroic and a dogish forte in the tau. This means that this preposition used to be geminant. So now you can tell the difference between pronominal suffixes attached to the definite direct object marker and pronominal suffixes attached to the preposition with. Here's one way to remember the spelling of the definite direct object marker with the pronominal suffixes. In the abbreviation DDOM, we have that English letter O, and that corresponds to the O-class vowel that the definite direct object marker takes when it takes a pronominal suffix. Similarly, the preposition with, W-I-T-H in English, has an I-class vowel in it, I, and it is spelled with the I-class vowel heroic in each of its forms. So remember, the DDOM has O, and the preposition eighth has I. And if you memorize it that way, you won't confuse the forms. Finally, we want to briefly consider pronominal suffixes with the preposition im and the noun both having the same consonantal spelling, but vocalized differently. The preposition im with heroic and the noun am with pathic. In the left column, we have the preposition im with the full set of pronominal suffixes, and you'll observe that in every form there's a dogish forte in the mem of the preposition, and the vowel under the ion is heroic, meaning with. In the right column, you'll also observe a dogish forte in each mem. Both the preposition im and the noun am are geminant, but in the right column, with the noun am, the vowel under the ion is pathic. So the only way to distinguish between the preposition and the noun is the vowel under the first letter, heroic for the preposition, pathic for the noun. We conclude then with the pronominal suffix summary chart. Now this chart is going to be very helpful for you for distinguishing between all the different suffixes, both the type 1, the type 2, and the alternate. However, if you memorize the type 1 suffixes with the inseparable preposition lamed, you'll get the gist of what's going on here. For example, let's consider a couple things together. First, in the 3MS category, observe that all forms have a wow in the spelling, whether it's a holum wow, a shuric, or a consonantal wow. The wow unites the 3MS forms. In the 3FS category, there's always an A-class vowel and a hey. In the 2MS form, there's always a final cough with a commas inside that final cough. In the 2FS form, there's always a final cough with a schwa in it. In the 1CS form, there's always a yod, heroic yod, nun heroic yod, or pathic yod. When it comes to these pronominal suffixes, it's helpful to memorize what's similar about each form so you can begin to make the connections. In the 3MP, there's always a mem, hem, or ahem. In the 3FP, there's always a nun, hen, on, or ahen. In the 2MP, there's always a chem, kaf, sagol, mem. The same is true for the 2FP, but it's ken, kaf, sagol, nun. And in the 1CP, we have nu in every form. So even though it looks like there's a lot of variety in these forms, there's a lot of similarity, and it's important to focus on the similarity so that you're not overwhelmed by all the diversity. So before you move on from this chapter, you must become familiar with the form, person, gender, number, and translation values, both possessive and objective, for both type 1, including the alternate, and type 2, pronominal suffixes. Become familiar with the types of changes a noun will experience with the addition of a pronominal suffix, especially the masculine plural and the feminine singular nouns. It may be helpful to memorize the paradigm of the preposition lamed with each of the pronominal suffixes in 9.10 of your grammar. Well, this concludes our study of pronominal suffixes attached to Hebrew nouns, prepositions, and the definite direct object marker. Welcome to the lecture for Basics of Biblical Hebrew, Chapter 10, the Hebrew construct chain. In this lecture, we will cover the basic grammar of the Hebrew construct chain and the spelling of nouns in the construct state. Now, the Hebrew construct chain and the construct state are going to be new to most of us who are familiar only with English, but let me give you an example of what we're looking at. In the NIV translation of the Old Testament, the English word of appears over 20,000 times. But in Hebrew, there is no word for of. In the ESV, the English word of appears in the Old Testament 26,000 times. But again, there is no word for of in Hebrew. So how do we get the word of in English? And the answer is the construct chain. The construct chain is what produces that of translation for us in English. So we're going to be looking really in our own minds at the word of in chapter 10. Let's consider some basic grammar in the Hebrew construct chain. First, as I've just stated, there is no word for of in biblical Hebrew. Rather, Hebrew expresses the of or possessive relationship between two nouns by what is called the construct chain. You can see in the example below that we have two nouns that are side by side, Eved Hamelech, translated servant of the king. This is an example of a construct chain. The first of the two nouns in the construct chain is called the construct noun and is said to be in the construct state. The second of the two nouns is called the absolute noun and is said to be in the absolute state. The absolute form of a noun is also its lexical form. Let's look together at our example again. We have Eved Hamelech. The noun on the right is the construct noun as it's been labeled. The noun on the left is the absolute noun. The construct noun and the absolute noun together form the construct chain, Eved Hamelech. This relationship produces the of translation in English. Let's look at the Hebrew construct chain in terms of certain rules of grammar. In Hebrew, construct chains are either entirely definite or entirely indefinite, but the construct noun will never take the definite article. The definiteness or indefiniteness of a construct chain is determined by the definiteness or indefiniteness of the absolute noun. Let's look at our examples below. In the left-hand column, we have indefinite construct chains, Kol Ish, Melech Eretz, and Eved Melech. The construct noun is the first noun in the chain, and the absolute noun is the second or last noun in the construct chain. Notice that each of the nouns that are in the absolute state, Ish, Eretz, or Melech, are indefinite. That is, they don't have the definite article. For that reason, the entire construct chain is translated as an indefinite construct chain. A voice of a man, a king of a land, or a servant of a king. Now let's look at the examples on the right. Here we have three definite construct chains, and they're very similar to the construct chains on the left that are indefinite. The only difference is the addition of the definite article to the absolute noun. Kol ha-ish, Melech ha-aretz, Eved Hamelech. You'll observe in these translations that the entire construct chain is translated definitely. Now, the voice of the man, or the king of the land, or the servant of the king. Notice that in the construct chain, there's only one definite article on the absolute noun, but every noun in the construct chain is translated as if it had the definite article. This is because a construct chain in Hebrew is either entirely indefinite or entirely definite, and the definiteness or indefiniteness of any construct chain is determined by the absolute noun or the last noun in the construct chain. Well, in what other circumstances is a noun considered to be definite? And there are really three circumstances in which a noun is considered to be definite. The first one we've already encountered. If an absolute noun has the definite article, it's definite, and therefore the entire chain is definite, as in our example, Kol ha-ish, the voice of the man. However, if the absolute noun has a pronominal suffix, it's also considered to be definite, as in Beit Malki, the house of my king. The pronominal suffix on king makes the absolute noun definite, and therefore the entire chain is definite. And finally, if the absolute noun is a proper noun, it is considered to be definite. So in the example, Eved Shemuel, the servant of Samuel, that because the absolute noun is a proper noun, the entire chain is considered to be definite. So under three circumstances is a noun considered to be definite and therefore provoke the entire construct chain to be definite. If the noun has a definite article, if the noun has a pronominal suffix, or if the noun is a proper noun or a proper name. With the Hebrew construct chain, you can have multiple construct nouns, but only one absolute noun. Let's look at the screen together. Multiple construct nouns may appear in a given construct chain, but there is only one absolute noun for each construct chain. In our three examples below, you'll see a series of construct nouns appearing in a construct chain, and they're highlighted in red. So in our first example, we have two construct nouns, Eved Achi, followed by the absolute noun, Hamelech, the servant of the brother of the king. In our second construct chain, we have, again, two nouns, Melech Kol, followed by a definite absolute noun, Haaretz, the king of all of the earth. In our final example, we have four construct nouns, followed by a definite absolute noun because it has a pronominal suffix. We have Kol, Mishpachath, Beith, Avi, Imo, all of the family, of the house, of the father, of his mother. So in the grammar of the construct chain, you can have multiple construct nouns, but only one absolute noun. You can only have one final noun, and that final noun is always the absolute noun. In Hebrew, construct chains can appear as the object of a preposition. So a construct noun may appear with one of the inseparable prepositions. In this case, the construct chain functions as the object of the preposition. So look at our first example below. We have Baveith David, in the house of David, or Kekol Hagoyim, like all of the nations, or La'am Haaretz, to the people of the land. In each of these cases, the construct chain functions as the object of the preposition. Now, it's important to understand that a Hebrew construct chain is a group of closely related words. They're bound together by an accent, a single accent. In fact, all of the construct nouns will surrender their accent to the absolute noun to join them together. Because of this, no competing words may appear within the construct chain. So if you're going to have adjectives or demonstratives modifying nouns in that chain, they're going to have to appear after and outside of the chain. Let's look together at the screen. When an adjective modifies either the construct or absolute noun, it must follow the entire chain and agree with the noun it modifies in gender, number, and definiteness. So you're going to have to be a little bit of a detective here and figure out which noun the adjective is modifying based on matching it with gender and number and definiteness. Let's look at our first example together. We have Devar, Hamelcha, Hatov. You can see in this particular construct chain, followed by the adjective tov, that we have the good word of the queen. The adjective follows the construct chain, and so we have to figure out, does it modify word or does it modify queen? Because the adjective is masculine and singular, it must be modifying the masculine singular noun devar. It can't be modifying the word queen because queen is feminine and singular. But let's look at our second example. Devar Hamelcha Hatovah. In this second example, again, we have the adjective appearing outside of the construct chain, Devar Hamelcha. Does it modify the noun Devar or the noun Melcha, queen? Because the adjective is feminine and singular, we know that it must be modifying the word queen because queen is feminine singular and the word for word is masculine singular. So do you understand the adjective is going to match the noun that it modifies inside the construct chain? So that means that sometimes you might not know which noun the adjective is modifying. You have to determine that based on context, and that's our third example. Devar, Hamelech, Hatov. In this example, once again, the adjective appears outside of the construct chain, and it's masculine and singular. But both of the nouns in the construct chain are considered masculine and singular and definite, like the adjective. So we could translate this either as the good word of the king or the word of the good king. And depending upon context, you would make that decision. The same is true with demonstrative adjectives. When a demonstrative adjective modifies either the construct or absolute noun, it too must follow the entire chain and agree with the noun that it modifies in gender, number, and definiteness. So you can see in our first example, Divrei Hanavi Hazeh, the words of this prophet. The demonstrative is masculine and singular and occurs outside of the construct chain. And so it's modifying navi because navi is masculine and singular inside the construct chain. The word divrei is masculine and plural. In our second example, divrei hanavi hatov hazeh, we see the construct chain divrei hanavi followed by an adjective, hatov, and a demonstrative, hazeh. In this case, because the adjective and the demonstrative are masculine and singular and definite, we know that they're modifying the word prophet because the word divrei is masculine and plural. So the words of this good prophet. So remember, the words in a construct chain cannot be broken. And so if there are going to be other words modifying the chain, those words will have to appear after the chain, and you'll have to figure out which nouns they're modifying in the chain. There's one last point of grammar before we move into the spelling of nouns in the construct state, and that has to do with adjectives in the construct state. In Hebrew, a substantival adjective can appear just like a noun in the construct state. Remember, a substantival adjective is an adjective that's functioning like a noun. So whatever a noun can do, that substantival adjective can do. So here we have three examples of adjectives that are functioning substantively in the construct state. Yefath mar'eh, beautiful of appearance. Chacham lev, wise of heart. Or kadosh Yisrael, the Holy One of Israel. In each instance, the substantival adjective is highlighted in red and is in the construct state, and it's followed by the absolute noun. Now that we've covered the basic grammar of the Hebrew construct chain, we're going to turn our attention to the spelling of construct nouns. Let's consider two important facts together. First, when a noun appears in the construct state, it surrenders its primary accent to the absolute noun. The loss of the accent causes spelling changes in most construct nouns. So here's actually what makes a noun or throws a noun into the construct state. It joins to the absolute noun by surrendering its accent to the absolute noun. And this is what glues the absolute and the construct nouns together. They're considered one accented unit. Okay, so the types of spelling changes encountered with most construct nouns can be grouped into two basic categories. Are you ready? Number one, vowel reduction. And number two, a change in the ending of construct nouns. The good news is that in terms of vowel reduction, you already know all of the rules that will apply to the construct nouns when those vowels reduce. And the endings on construct nouns make them easy to identify, and they're not that hard to learn. So this won't be too complicated, but it'll be very helpful for you to know how to identify a noun in the construct state. First, we're going to begin with vowel reduction in closed syllables. Here's the rule. In the construct state, changeable long vowels in a closed syllable reduce to short vowels because they now appear in an unaccented syllable. Here's what happens. When a word surrenders its accent, closed accented syllables now become unaccented. Now a closed accented syllable takes a long vowel, but a closed unaccented syllable takes a short vowel. So there's going to be a slight shift in the spelling of a word, and this shift is going to confirm for you that the noun is in the construct state. So let's look at some examples of closed accented syllables reducing their vowels in the construct state. The first example is mishpat. The absolute or lexical form is with the comets in the final closed syllable. In the construct state, we have mishpat. The comets has reduced to pathic in what is now a closed, unaccented syllable. In our second example, we have midbar for wilderness. And then we have midbar, where the comets has reduced to pathic, meaning wilderness of. The reason for that reduction is because now that second syllable in midbar is closed and unaccented. In our last two examples, bain meaning sun and kol meaning all, we have two monosyllabic words with changeable long vowels in their spelling, tseri for bain and holim for kol. In the construct state, because those nouns will surrender their accent, the vowels will reduce. Seri to sagol in ben, son of, and holim to kamet satuf in kol, all of. You understand why these vowels reduce. It's because the construct noun surrenders its accent, and so closed syllables will take short vowels as short as possible. In fact, you can think of it this way. In the construct state, a noun is going to try to have all of its vowels be as short as possible. In closed syllables, those will be short vowels. In open syllables, those will be the schwa or the hatef vowels, the shortest possible vowels. And if you have unchangeable long vowels, those will resist change. So those don't want to change at all. So in the construct state, vowels will be as short as possible in each of the potential syllables. That means vowel reduction in open syllables, you're going to see a lot of propretonic reduction. So in the construct state, changeable long vowels in an open syllable reduce to vocal schwa, or hatef pathic with the gutturals, because the syllable moves into the propretonic position. This is simply propretonic reduction, and you've seen that several times in the noun chapters throughout this grammar. So in our first three examples, you'll observe the long vowel comets under the first letter in each form, navi, hamon, davar. When we throw these into the construct state, you'll see that that long vowel has reduced to vocal schwa or the hatef pathic with the guttural in the second example. Navi, hamon, davar. The reason the vowel has changed from comets to vocal schwa or hatef pathic is because those open syllables are no longer pretonic. They're propretonic in the construct state because it's the absolute noun that now has the accent, not the construct noun. So closed syllables will reduce to short vowels. Open syllables will reduce to vocal schwa or a hatef pathic with gutturals. Both of those changes you've already seen. You should be very comfortable with them by now. This is a great place to review that information and to become comfortable seeing that phenomenon. Now with certain nouns, especially plural nouns, you may have multiple syllables move into the propretonic state. And when that happens, you're going to get the application of rule of schwa 1 or rule of schwa 2. Let's look together. In the construct state, vowel reduction in certain plural nouns may require the application of rule of schwa 1. Let's look at the examples in the left-hand column, and you'll see these plural nouns, barachoth, davarim, tzavaoth. You'll also observe that under the first syllable, we already have vocal schwa. When these nouns move into the construct state, the second syllable will also become propretonic and reduce to vocal schwa. You would then have two vocal schwas at the beginning of the word. And the rule of schwa 1 states that when you have two vocal schwas at the beginning of a word, it will change to hirik followed by a silent schwa. And that's exactly what we have in our three examples on the right. Hirik under all three first root letters, and then vocal schwa under the second letter in each form. So now we have birkoth, divrei, and sivoth, each of which are following rule of schwa 1. You have already observed that masculine plural nouns, when they take pronominal suffixes, drop their masculine plural ending and just add the type 2 pronominal suffix. So there's something about that masculine plural noun that likes to change the eam when other things are affecting it. The same is true for masculine plural and dual nouns in the construct state. Look at your screens with me, and you'll see that in the construct state, the masculine and plural dual endings change to sere yod in each form. So look in the examples on the left. This is an easy change to see. We have Elohim for God, Banim for sons, and Einayim, the dual noun for two eyes. In the construct state, those endings, im or ayim, change to sere yod in each case. So now we have Elohe, Baneh, and Einay. The sere yod at the ending of any noun is a clear indicator of the masculine plural construct state. It makes it very easy to identify the function of these words in their context. So look out for that sere yod. It almost always marks masculine plural construct. Let's look at feminine singular nouns in the construct state. In the construct state, the feminine singular ending comets he changes to pathic tau. Now, you've already seen this happen when feminine singular nouns ending in comets he take pronominal suffixes. That weak he at the end has to strengthen to a tau before it can take the suffix. In the same way, when a feminine singular noun ending in comets he moves into the construct state, that weak he cannot remain, so it either drops off or strengthens to a tau. And in this case, with feminine singular nouns that end in comets he, in the construct state, that changes to a pathic tau. Let's look at our examples together. We have three examples of feminine singular nouns that end in comets he: Torah, Malkah, and Shana. In the construct state, the comets he changes to pathic tau. torath, malkath, shanath. This makes it very easy to identify feminine singular nouns in the construct state. The change in form identifies the change in function. What about feminine plural nouns? In the construct state, the feminine plural ending oath does not change. And this is exactly what we saw with pronominal suffixes added to feminine plural nouns. That oath ending is kind of the opposite of the comets hey ending. With feminine singular nouns, that comets hey ending is super weak. But with feminine plural nouns, that oath ending is super strong. It will not budge, and so it's maintained in the construct state. So you can observe here with these nouns, our absolute nouns, mamlakoth, mishpachoth, banoth. You'll observe that in the construct state, the holem wow tau feminine plural ending is maintained in each of the forms, mamlachoth, mishpachoth, banoth. You'll be able to identify these forms as construct nouns because of a slight change in spelling. For example, in the word banoth, daughters of, the comets under the beit is changed to vocal schwa. Or the comets under the pei in families of, mishpachoth, has changed to vocal schwa. And similarly, in the word kingdoms of, mamlachoth, the comets has changed to vocal schwa. So there will be other indicators of the construct state in these feminine nouns, but the endings will not change. Let's now take a look at masculine nouns ending with sagol hey. Follow along with me on the screen. In the construct state, masculine singular nouns ending with sagol hey change to sere hey. So let's look at the three examples at the bottom of the page. We have sadeh, machaneh, and mateh. Each of those absolute nouns on the left side of the page end in sagol hey. That's their lexical form. All nouns that end in sagol hey are masculine. In the construct state, the sagol hey changes to sere hey in each instance. Sadeh, machaneh, mateh. This slight change in spelling from sagol hey to sere hey is what identifies the construct state for masculine nouns that end with sagol hey. This is a trickier change to see because it's just really in our own mind the loss of a single dot, and so you've got to pay attention to detail to recognize these nouns as masculine singular construct nouns. We now turn our attention to monosyllabic nouns in the construct state. Read along with me. In the construct state, certain but not all singular monosyllabic nouns add hierik yod to their stem in the construct state. So let's look at our examples together. We have av, ach, and peh, father, brother, and mouth. Notice that in the construct state, avi, achi, and pi, each of the nouns now ends with a hierik yod. That hierik yod appears only with certain singular monosyllabic nouns, but it does identify them as being in the construct state. Be careful not to confuse this hierik yod ending with the 1cs type 1 pronominal suffix. That appears in a different context. These are construct nouns that add hierik yod in the construct state. It's not the 1cs type 1 pronominal suffix. We're almost done. Hang in there. What about plural segulate nouns? Read along with me. In the construct state, plural segulate nouns begin with a short vowel in a closed syllable. This is a little bit of a trickier change, and you simply have to memorize the type of change that is going to appear with a plural segulate noun. Let's look at the examples together. We have three segulate nouns in the left: Eved, meaning servant, Shevet, meaning tribe, and Chodesh, meaning month. In the masculine plural construct state, you'll see both the masculine plural ending, sere yod, but a different vowel pattern at the beginning of the word. Avdei, Shivtei, Chadshe. In each case, we have a short vowel under the first letter, pathic, hierik, or kamet satuf, followed by a silent schwa under the second letter. This is the formative pattern of plural segulate nouns. You just have to memorize this pattern. There's a reason for the appearance of these short vowels, but you don't need to know it. You simply need to memorize that plural segulate nouns are going to take a short vowel in a closed syllable at the beginning of the word, but they're going to also maintain the sere yod masculine plural ending that easily identifies them as masculine plural construct. Next, we turn our attention to the ay diphthongs in the construct state, and this is something we also encountered in the last chapter, so it should be a point of review. Read along with me. Once again, in the construct state, the ay diphthong changes to sere yod, and the aw diphthong changes to holem wow. Let's look at the examples below. In our first example, we have buyeth with the ay diphthong, meaning house, and maweth with the aw diphthong, meaning death. In the construct state, the ay diphthong buyeth becomes baith, sarah yod, and the aw diphthong becomes holem wow, moth. This is the same change that you saw when pronominal suffixes were added to the ay and aw diphthongs. The ay diphthong converts to sarah yod, and the aw diphthong converts to holem wow. So this is not anything new. This is something you already know, applied to a different situation, the construct state. Finally, there's the category no change in spelling. Read along with me. Certain monosyllabic nouns with unchangeable long vowels, like holem wow, shurik, or hirik yod, and singular seglet nouns exhibit no spelling changes in the construct state. Now you may think this is good news, but actually it's not. With these nouns, there's no formal spelling change to help you understand or identify them as construct nouns. You'll have to determine that they're a construct noun based upon context. So let's look, for example, at the nouns we're talking about. In the first two examples, we have monosyllabic nouns, or just nouns with one syllable, and the vowel in that syllable is an unchangeable long vowel. So for kol, it's holem wow, and for shir, it's hirik yod. And those vowels, because they're unchangeable long vowels, they resist reduction in the construct state. So they're spelled the same way in the construct, kol or shir, voice of or song of. In our third example, melech, it's a seglet noun, and singular seglet nouns do not change their spelling in the construct state. So the construct form of melech is melech, king of. You'll have to determine based on context whether one of these nouns are in the construct state or not. And usually it's not that difficult to do it when you're reading in context. So that brings us to the conclusion of our study of construct nouns in Biblical Hebrew. Before you move on, here's what you must do or know. First, you must become familiar with the basic grammar of the Hebrew construct chain. For example, know which noun is the construct noun, which noun is the absolute noun. How does definiteness or indefiniteness work? How do words modify construct nouns? How many construct nouns can you have? How many absolute nouns can you have? You need to know those items of grammar that we talked about in the first part of chapter 10. Second, memorize the important spelling features associated with nouns in the construct state. Remember, you already know the rules that govern most of the changes in spelling for construct nouns. In fact, there are only two new patterns presented in this chapter. The masculine plural construct ending, sarah yod, and the seri hey ending for sagol hey nouns. Those are really the only two new spelling features you've learned in this chapter. Everything else you've already had. So when you're working through those changes in spelling, make sure you understand why they happen and where you've learned them before and how you're applying them to these new nouns in the construct state. Other than that, once you memorize the grammar and the form of construct nouns, you're good to go for the next chapter. Welcome to the lecture for Basics of Biblical Hebrew, Chapter 11, Hebrew Numbers. This is the final chapter in the second section of the grammar, and after this we'll be moving into the verb section. Let's look at Hebrew numbers together. In this lecture, we will cover cardinal numbers in Hebrew and ordinal numbers in Hebrew. What does that look like? Biblical Hebrew does not have a separate set of numerical symbols, as we do in English. Rather, Hebrew numbers are written out. In Hebrew, there are both cardinal and ordinal numbers. Cardinal numbers are used for counting, as in 1, 2, or 3, and ordinal numbers are used to indicate position in a series, as in first, second, or third. We'll be considering both of those in this chapter. Let's begin with the cardinal numbers. You'll see on your screen that cardinal numbers are inflected for gender, masculine or feminine, and they also have different forms in the absolute and the construct. So that's why we have 4 columns on this page. The first column is the masculine absolute column. The second column is the masculine construct column. The third column is feminine absolute, and the fourth column is feminine construct. Now the changes that appear in the spelling of the numbers will be familiar to you from your study of the construct state and masculine versus feminine nouns earlier, so there's nothing new to worry about here. What we want to focus on is memorizing the cardinal numbers 1 through 10. And after that, we'll be applying certain rules to them in terms of how they're used. So let's read these cardinal numbers together in the masculine absolute column. Echad, Shnayim, Shalosh, Arba, Chamesh, Shesh, Sheva, Shemoneh, Tesha, and Eser. Those are the cardinal numbers 1 through 10. Let me read through them again quickly for review. Echad, Shnayim, Shalosh, Arba, Chamesh, Shesh, Sheva, Shemoneh, Tesha, Eser. These numbers must be memorized as vocabulary items. It's also fun to be able to count in Hebrew, and so it's fun to memorize them in order. Notice that for the number 1, there's a slight spelling change between the masculine absolute and the feminine absolute and construct. The dalet of the masculine absolute form is spelled with a tau in the feminine absolute and in the feminine construct. So note that change. Additionally, with regard to number 2, shanayim, the feminine absolute, shatayim, and the feminine construct, shatay, are spelled with tau rather than nu. Those two changes for 1 and 2 in Hebrew should be memorized. Now we will move to cardinal numbers 11 through 19. When these numbers are spelled out, they're spelled with a combination of the word 10 and the number 1 through 9 that you learned in the previous chapter. So you can see in each of these numbers, with regard to 11, for example, so you'll see with each of these numbers, they all end with asar, one of the spellings for the Hebrew number 10. And then in the first position, we'll see 110, which is 11, 210, which is 12, 310, which is 13, and 410, which is 14, and 510, which is 15, etc. So you're going to have to do a little math when you're counting from 11 to 19. You'll begin with the number in the series 1 through 9, and then you'll end with 10, and you'll add those two numbers together. 1 and 10 equals 11. Those are the cardinal numbers 11 through 19. You don't necessarily have to memorize each of those numbers. You just need to know how to add 1 and 10 to get to 11. What about cardinal numbers 20 through 99? These numbers are interesting. Each of them is the masculine plural of another number. If you look, for example, at the number 20, it's the masculine plural form of 10. Then if you look at 30, it's the masculine plural form of 3. So the word for 3 is shalosh. The word for 30 is shaloshim, the masculine plural of shalosh. So let's read the remaining numbers together. After shaloshim, there's arba'im, chamashim, shishim, shiv'im, shemunim, and tishim. Those are 20 and 30 and 40 and 50 and 60 and 70 and 80 and 90. If you memorized the cardinal numbers 1 through 10 at the beginning, then these are simply the masculine plural forms of those cardinal numbers to indicate 20 through 90. What about the cardinal numbers for over 100? Well, there are a couple of new numbers that you're going to need to memorize, and then you're going to be able to do some math. Let's look at the numbers first that you must memorize. The first one is mea for 100. That's simply going to be a vocabulary item for you. The second word you must memorize is the word for 1,000, elef. Then you're going to need to do some math. And finally, the third word you're going to need to memorize in this page is ravava for 10,000. So you'll need to memorize mea for 100, elef for 1,000, and ravava for 10,000. The rest of them can be deduced based on their form. Let's go back up to the 100s. The word for 200, mathayim, is the feminine dual of mea, 100. So if you double 100, you get 200. That's the feminine dual form. After that, you'll have a number like shalosh, meaning 3, and then the feminine plural form of 100. So that's 300s, or 300. Again, with this number, you'll have to do math. Let's look at 2,000 together. With 2,000, we have the feminine dual of 1,000, elef. 1,000 is elef, 2,000 is alpayim, the feminine dual form. And then for 3,000 and following, you'll have the number 3 plus the masculine plural form for 1,000, alafim. The same reality exists for 10,000. That is, the word for 20,000 will be the feminine dual form of the word ravava, so ribothium. And then 30,000 will be the form of the word 3 plus riboth, the feminine plural form for 10,000. So you have 3 patterns that exist here. In the hundreds category, you'll have the noun you must memorize, mea, the feminine dual form, mathium, and then the feminine plural form with another number to indicate the numbers in that series. The same will happen for those forms for the thousands and the 10,000s. You'll have the singular, the dual, and then the plural with another number. So concentrate on those patterns, but there are only 3 words here you must memorize: mea for 100, aleph for 1,000, and ravava for 10,000. Finally, we come to the ordinal numbers that appear in the Hebrew Bible, and you'll see that most of the ordinal numbers look like a form of the cardinal number you've memorized at the very beginning. The only outstanding difference is the ordinal number for first, rishon in the masculine or rishonah in the feminine. This does not look like the cardinal number for 1. It looks like a form of the word rosh, meaning head or first, and that's exactly what it is. So if you can remember the word for head being at the top or first, then you'll know the noun rishon. In the other ordinal numbers, for example, sheni, shalishi, ravi'i, chamishi, shishi, etc., you'll notice that there's a preference for the hierarchic yod at the end of each form that indicates the ordinal number. In the plural, you'll have the hierarchic yod followed by a tau, shenith, shalishith, ravi'ith, chamishith, shishith, etc. And that tau is indicative or diagnostic of feminine forms in Hebrew. These forms are fairly easy to memorize because they're very closely related to their cardinal numbers. They simply appear with a number of hierarchic yods in the midst to pronounce them. Before we bring this chapter to a conclusion, let's do a little bit of translation practice together to see how these numbers work in context. Look with me at example number 1. Shalosh, esrei, shana. We're going to move from right to left, 3, 10, and year. Now, when we add 3 and 10 together, we get 13, and that's followed by the feminine singular noun shana, meaning year. We're going to translate it, however, 13 years. Even though the feminine noun there is singular, year, we're going to take its number from the number that precedes it. And because 13 is plural, we're going to translate that noun as plural. Let's look at our second example. Arba'ah, asar, yom. Here we have the number at the beginning, 4 and 10. So that's going to be 14, followed by the masculine singular noun yom, meaning day, so 14 days. Now let's look at some of the genealogy lists from the book of Genesis. With these next 3 examples, they begin with a verb in the first position, followed by the proper noun or the name of the person they're describing in gray. So we have, and Seth lived. And how long did he live? Chamesh shanim uma'ath shana. Let's put all that together. How long did Seth live? He lived 5 years and 100 years. Now, if we do our math, that's 105 years. Let's look at our fourth example. And Jared lived. How long did he live? Shatayim washishim shana. Uma'ath shana. Let's put all that together. And Jared lived 2 and 60 year and 100 year. Well, if we add 2 and 60 and 100, we get 162. So Hebrew is not only good for learning the Bible, it's also good for reviewing your math. In our fifth example, we have the fact that Methuselah lived for a long period of time. And how long was that? He lived Sheva, Ushemonim, Shana, Uma'ath, Shana. Let's put all that together. Methuselah lived 7 and 80 year and 100 year. We put all that together, 100 plus 80 plus 7, and we get 187. Finally, we're going to look at all of the days of Methuselah in our very last example, where we have all of the days of Methuselah were Tesha, Washishim, Shana, Uthasha Mayoth Shana. Let's do some math. He lived Tesha, that's 9. He lived Shishim, that's 60, the masculine plural of 6. He lived 9. He lived 100 year. Okay, so we have here 9 and 60, that's going to be 69, and then 9 hundreds, that's going to be 900. So he lived 969 years. That's some pretty big math. One of the things you'll observe is that sometimes numbers will take singular nouns and sometimes numbers will take plural nouns, even though the numbers themselves are plural. Also, feminine numbers will frequently modify masculine nouns and masculine numbers will frequently modify feminine nouns. Numbers are a little bit tricky in terms of how they work and what nouns they modify. Sometimes a masculine singular number will modify a feminine plural noun. That's okay. You just need to know the number and the noun it's modifying, and you can do some math. Before we move on, therefore, you need to do the following things. First, memorize the masculine absolute cardinal numbers 1 through 10. Try to count from 1 to 10 in Hebrew. Memorize cardinal numbers 100, 1,000, and 10,000, or Mea, Elif, and Ravava. Understand how the remaining cardinal numbers are formed by doing a little bit of math. Finally, memorize the masculine ordinal number first, being Rishon, and then understand how the remaining ordinal numbers are formed with the different hierarch yods added in the middle and at the end of those ordinal numbers. That brings us to the conclusion of Chapter 11, Hebrew Numbers, and the conclusion to Section 2 in the grammar that deals with Hebrew nouns and nominals. Welcome to the lecture for Basics of Biblical Hebrew, Chapter 12. This is our introduction to the Hebrew verb system. In this lecture, we will cover the system of Hebrew roots, verbal person, gender, and number, the Hebrew verbal stems, the Hebrew verbal conjugations, how to identify strong and weak verbs, and normal word order in a verbal clause, how to parse Hebrew verbs, and the lexical form of Hebrew verbs. Now, I think it's important to begin by saying this chapter is not designed to be comprehensive in its scope, nor is there anything here to memorize. This chapter is a beginning overview of the basics of the verbal system, so you have some context for what we're about to do. We will move through each of the different parts that are presented in this chapter bit by bit as we progress through the rest of the grammar. So in some sense, for this lecture, you can sit back and relax and get an orientation to what you're about to do over the course of the next several chapters. Let's begin with roots and stems. You are about to discover that many of the nouns you have memorized as vocabulary have verbal counterparts. The reason for this relationship is due to the fact that they share a common root. Hebrew roots are typically composed of 3 consonants. We call these triconsonantal. But there is a small class of verbs that are composed of 2 consonants, and those are biconsonantal. The root contains the basic semantic information of the word. In other words, what does it mean? Look at your screen with me and you'll see a triconsonantal root, mem, lamed, kaf, on the left in red. You'll see in the right a series of words derived from that root. Every word in this list contains the mem, the lamed, and the kaf root, and the meanings of these words are all related to dominion and royalty. Let's consider these examples. The first word is the noun king, melech. Then you could see the feminine form, malka, for queen. The same verbal root, malkuth, means kingdom. And then mamlecha, dominion. Then there's malucha, meaning kingship or royalty. Finally, there's the verb, malak, meaning to reign or be king. You can see in each of these examples, the mem, lamed, and kaf are used to create words that have a related group of meanings. By knowing the relationship between roots and stems, you can really help grow your vocabulary in Hebrew. Once you know that mem, lamed, and kaf relates to royalty and kingship, you'll be able to understand all of the related words that contain these same root letters. This is the difference between roots and stems. The root contains the basic semantic information, the basic meaning of all of the words that are derived from it. You're also going to learn that Hebrew verbs have person, gender, and number, much like the personal pronouns that we studied in the noun chapter. In Hebrew, a verb can have person that'll be either first, second, or third. First person gender is I or we in English. Second person gender is you. And third person gender is he, she, it, or they. This is something that you should already know from your study of English. With regard to gender, verbs can be masculine, referring to masculine subjects, feminine, referring to feminine subjects, or common, referring to masculine or feminine subjects. Finally, Hebrew verbs have number. They will either be singular or plural. By singular, referring to one person or thing, and by plural, referring to more than one person or thing. You'll see how this works in the next chapter when we begin to study verbs, and you'll see how they have person, gender, and number, much like English verbs will with personal pronouns. In addition to verbal roots, Hebrew also inflects verbs in what are called verbal stems, and we need to look at the verbal stems. The stems in Hebrew are something that we have not had in English before, and so this is going to be something very new for most of us. There are 7 basic stems in biblical Hebrew. They encode verbal action, which can be simple, causative, or intensive, and verbal voice, which would be active, passive, or reflexive. And we'll cover each of those items in turn. The names of the 7 stems are as follows. The kal stem is the basic stem in Hebrew, and we'll be spending much time on this particular stem. The kal stem constitutes almost 70% of the Hebrew verbal system, so from chapters 13 all the way to 22, we'll be focusing on this one stem, the kal stem. Next, we will encounter the nifal stem, the hifil stem, the hofal stem, the piel stem, the pual stem, and the hithpael stem. Now, these names will be unfamiliar to you. They are actually transliterated Hebrew names, and you can see the forms from which they're derived in this second column. Beginning again at the top, kal, nifal, hifil, hofal, piel, pual, and hithpael. You'll also see that the names of the stems have features highlighted in red. Those are the features that make those particular verbal stems work. For example, if we look at the nifal, we see a noon heric prefix and an A-class vowel under the ayin, and those two features identify the verb as nifal. So it's important that you memorize these names in English, not necessarily in Hebrew, because they'll clue you in on what those verbs actually look like when we see them in context. One more time there, the kal, the nifal, the hifil, the hofal, the piel, the pual, and the hithpael. Those are the 7 basic verbal stems in Hebrew, and they encode verbal action and verbal voice. You can see on your screens how these stems are related in terms of voice and action. In this left-hand column running vertically, we have the active voice, the passive voice, and the reflexive voice. And in the upper horizontal columns, we have the simple action, the causative action, and the intensive action. And so these stems are arranged in such a way as to encode particular types of information for the verbs. So is it a simple action with an active voice or a simple action with a passive voice? Is it a causative type of action with an active or passive voice? Or an intensive action with an active or passive voice? That's how these stems work. Now, there's nothing like this in English, and so it's going to be interesting for you to see how this unfolds in a language like Hebrew. Let's take a brief look at how some of these stems are translated. This is not for memorization, it's only for orientation, so don't worry about trying to memorize all of this as we work through it. Just enjoy the description. First, we have our kal form, shema, meaning he heard. This is just a simple active verb, so we're just going to translate it simply as he heard. The next form is nishma. That's the nifal verb, and the nifal verb is the passive of the kal, and it also has a simple type of action, so we'll translate it passively with the form of the verb to be, he was heard. Next, we move to 2 causative action verbs. The hifil, which is himlik, translated as he made someone king. And then hamlak, the hofal passive causative, he was made king. So you can see here in the hifil and the hofal the causative nuance by the form of the verb. So you can see here in the hifil and hofal the causative nuance with the translation made in each example. He made or caused someone to be king. He was made or caused to be king. In our final three categories, we have intensive types of action. Shaber in the PL, Shubar in the Pual, and Hithabe in the Hithpael. Here we have intensive types of action, and there are lots of intensive types of actions. We'll start with simple intensive. He smashed something into pieces instead of simply he broke. Then the Pual is the passive of the Peel. Here it was smashed into pieces. And then finally, the Hithpael is intensive but also reflexive. And so we're going to use a reflexive pronoun to translate this. So Hithchabe means he hid himself. The reflexive pronoun himself renders that reflexively. So those are some of the basic ways in which these verbs look and are translated. And we're going to work through each of these in the subsequent chapters one by one. And so you'll be very familiar with them by the time you finish the grammar. In addition to 7 verbal stems, there are 6 conjugations in Biblical Hebrew. Now, if you think of the verbal root as containing the basic meaning of the verb, the semantic information, and the verbal stem encoding the type of action and the type of voice, the conjugations that we now encounter are going to tell you how these verbs function. So the root is the meaning, the stem will encode voice and type of action, and then the conjugations will tell us how these verbs are functioning in context. There are 6 different conjugations in Biblical Hebrew. Each conjugation has a slightly different verbal function. The 6 conjugations in Biblical Hebrew are the perfect, the imperfect, the imperative, the infinitive construct, the infinitive absolute, and the participle. Let's go back to the perfect. The perfect, or what is also called the suffix conjugation, is one of only 2 main finite verbal conjugations in Biblical Hebrew. It's used for completed actions in the past, present, or future. The imperfect, or the prefix conjugation, is the other main finite verbal conjugation in Biblical Hebrew. It's used for incomplete actions in the past, present, or future. So the opposition is this. In the perfect or suffix conjugation, we have completed actions, and in the imperfect or prefix conjugation, we have incomplete actions. Next, we move to the imperative, and the imperative is used to express direct commands, request permission, or communicate a request. The imperative only occurs in the second person, down to the 4th conjugation, the infinitive construct. The infinitive construct is a verbal noun with a variety of functions in Biblical Hebrew, often translated with to plus a verb, as in to study, just like in English. Then there's the infinitive absolute, used in conjunction with other verbs to highlight the verbal action. It's often got an adverbial nuance. It may also be used in the place of an imperative. And finally, there's the participle, a verbal adjective having both verbal and adjectival characteristics. These are the 6 conjugations in Biblical Hebrew. And again, we're going to be moving through each of these conjugations one at a time in one chapter per conjugation. So you don't have to worry about understanding everything now. I'm just giving you the overview. There are 2 finite verbal conjugations, the perfect and the imperfect. There's the imperative for commands. There's the infinitive construct, which is a verbal noun. There's the infinitive absolute, which kind of has adverbial, imperatival functions. And then there's the participle, the verbal adjective. There's a lot of overlap and correspondence with English in these conjugations, but there's also a lot of new things that we'll be learning as we move forward. Next, we need to talk about the classification of verbal roots. In Hebrew, there are both strong and weak verbal roots. Strong verbal roots have strong consonants in them, and weak verbal roots have 1 or more weak root consonants in them. Let's look at the screen together. Strong verbs have 3 root consonants with no weak consonants. Weak verbs, on the other hand, have 1 or more weak root consonants or a weak verbal root structure. And we'll talk about those now. The weak consonants in Hebrew include the gutturals and resh, and then yod and nun when they appear at the beginning of the verb. Now, you're already familiar from your study of nouns that the gutturals and resh are weak and they do weird things within a word. And you've already seen the nun assimilating with the preposition men, so you know that that particular letter has some idiosyncrasies to it. So the gutturals and resh, yod and nun are your weak root consonants. There are also some weak verbal root structures. These include, for example, biconsonantal verbs and geminate verbs. Now, biconsonantal verbs have only 2 root letters instead of 3, and geminate verbs, like geminate nouns, have identical second and third root consonants. So you have weak root letters and weak root structures. And those are the classification systems that we're going to be using. So let's look at some examples together. In the first column, we're going to see the weak root class. In the second column, we'll have an example of a verb that's weak from that class. And then in the third column, we'll have simply the description of what makes it weak. Let's begin with the one guttural category. With the one guttural category, you're going to have a guttural in the first root position. So with the example amad, you can see highlighted in red the guttural in first root position that makes it weak. With the two guttural category, you're going to have a guttural in the second root position. So with our example ga'al, you'll see the aleph highlighted in red. With third chet ayin, you're going to have either chet or ayin in the third root position, as you see in the example barach. The chet in that example is highlighted in red. With third aleph verbs, you're going to see an aleph in third root position, as you do in the example matzah. They're highlighted in red. With third hey verbs, you're going to see a hey in the third root position. This is a very common weak verb class in Biblical Hebrew, and so you'll become very familiar and comfortable with these verbs soon. Then we get the yod and nun categories. If the yod or nun appears in first root position, it's going to be weak. And so with our example here, yashav, you see the yod in first root position makes this particular verb weak. With the one nun category, we see nafal, and the nun in first root position makes this verb weak. So you'll see in each of these examples that we've already underlined the Roman numerals 1, 2, and 3. These Roman numerals identify the position of the weak root letter in the verb itself. So if the weak root letter is first, it's a 1 something verb. If the weak root letter is second, it will have the Roman numeral 2. And if the weak root letter is third, it will have the Roman numeral 3. Some verbs are doubly weak. That means they'll have more than one weak root feature. In the example Allah, it's both one guttural and third hey. Biconsonantal verbs will have only 2 root consonants, not 3. And geminate verbs will have the second and third root consonant being identical. This is the system of weak verbal roots in Hebrew. And again, you don't have to memorize this system now, but it's fairly easy to identify and place these Roman numerals in the right spot. Before we move on from this chapter, we should talk briefly about normal word order in a verbal clause with Hebrew. In Hebrew, normal word order in a verbal clause is verb, subject, object, abbreviated VSO. In the example that appears on your screen, bara Elohim eighth hashamayim wa eighth haaretz, God created the heavens and the earth, you will observe that the verb is in first position, the subject is in second position, and then 2 objects follow. This corresponds to normal word order, which is labeled as VSO, or verb, subject, object. You should also understand that the standard VSO pattern is frequently modified. Later, we will learn that the position of a verb in its clause is an important feature of syntax and verbal meaning. For now, though, we need a baseline to begin with, and the VSO, or verb, subject, object ordering, is what we're going to begin with. So when we're analyzing Hebrew verbs, we're going to be asked to parse Hebrew verbs. And when we parse Hebrew verbs, we're going to be identifying all of its different features. We're going to identify its stem, its conjugation, its root, its person, gender, and number, and any prefixes or suffixes that appear with it. So let me show you what that's going to look like. Parsing is the process of identifying a verb's stem, conjugation, person, gender, number, and lexical form or verbal root. Look at the example below, nishma. That verb, nishma, is nifal, perfect, 3ms, from the lexical form shama, or the verbal root simply shin, mim, ayin. Some instructors will prefer you to list the lexical form. Some instructors will prefer that you list the verbal root. You can do either. As you see below, in the parsing, we identify the verb's stem, nifal, its conjugation, perfect, its person, gender, and number, 3ms, and its lexical form. you should always use that order in your parsing. It's better to train yourself with a very specific order. So always begin with the stem and the conjugation and the person, gender, and number, then the lexical form or verbal root, and then any prefixes or suffix that may appear with the verb. That concludes our introduction to Hebrew verbs. It's the bird's eye view, the overview. And so before you move on from this chapter, you should understand that this chapter only serves as a general introduction to the Hebrew verbal system. Each of the items covered in this chapter will receive further attention in subsequent chapters. Additionally, except for vocabulary, there is no need to memorize any of the information presented in this chapter. However, it is important to become familiar with the system of weak verb classification in section 12.13 of the grammar.